There's a slap, open-handed slap there, correct?
That would be correct.
Okay. He's already exerted rough physical force previously.
But where does he stop at?
Well, he stops when he puts him in an isolated cell, is what the policy says, correct?
Well, he should have took him on to the isolated cell.
Correctly state your name to be Sheriff Esco Jarnigan. Yes, sir. And you are the Sheriff of Hamblen County? Yes, sir. And as such, you are the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for Hamblen County? Yes, sir. And,
That's not required, is it, for him to ball up his fist or to act as if he's going to assault? That's not required for a level 3 response, is it?
No, sir.
Okay. And so you said earlier, I would never second guess an officer, but in fact, that's exactly what you're doing. That's exactly what you did whenever you made this determination, because you didn't have the advantage of audio. You had not watched the video showing Mr. Kyle's aggressive behavior towards Mr. Coffey prior to making your decision, right?
That's correct.
You didn't speak to any corrections officers prior to making this decision that were present that day, did you?
No, sir.
You're not aware of any other incidents against him for excessive use of force, right?
Just rumors.
What is your understanding of the termination process for an employee that's no longer on probationary status with the Sheriff's Department?
In regards to what?
How does that to occur pursuant to the Sheriff's Civil Service Board?
On the termination?
Yes, sir.
We investigate the incident, and then we will have the employee come in, and Chief Mize will and talk to them. And at that point in time, my command staff and I, if necessary, we will all be involved. And most of the time, they will resign.
They'll resign.
Resign.
Was Mr. Coffey offered that?
I'm sure he will.
And how long has it been since you've received training on this use of force?
Well, probably over the 15 years that I have been there, we have rewritten the jail policies as well as the Sheriff's Department policy.
Okay. My question to you, sir, is when was the last time you received training on the use of force continuum?
I have no idea.
Several years ago?
Several years ago.
Sheriff Jarnigan has testified that he only saw one view of the video from when they were actually out in the hallway there. He had not viewed the annex portion of the video prior to making that termination decision.
I've not seen the annex part.
Okay. Do you think that would be important if there was events that occurred in there to determine whether or not Mr. Coffey's response to the situation was reasonable?
I'd say it has something to do with it, but that's not what happened outside.
Okay.
He was already terminated, I'm pretty sure, and the investigation on the assault was turned over to the district attorney's office.
Okay. Why was he at the jail, or why did Bob Ellis want to meet with him if he had already been terminated?
Can't remember if James was working that day or not. He was working that day.
Oh, you indicated. I'm just going on your own recollection here.
I mean,
So, it's your recollection that he had already been terminated?
I can't remember the series of events of the only time that I was involved with James and Bob was when Bob told him that he spoke with Corey didn't want to pursue anything.
Do you remember, were you the one that called down for James to come upstairs?
I think it was.
Okay. So would that refresh your recollection that he was still employed?
He was.
Okay. So he had not, did you ever have a conversation with Mr. Coffey concerning where or who he was going to vote for sheriff?
Yes.
Okay. Tell me about that conversation.
James Coffey called me when we were off under the really ball games about another inmate, or not an inmate, but another officer with some type of sticker on his vehicle. And then in conversation that I was told some things, and I asked James about it, and he denied it and confirmed some other things.
Okay. What do you recall as best you can how that conversation went?
That I was told that he was supporting Todd, and he said
Todd Davidson.
Todd Davidson, and that he was offered a position by Todd Davidson to be chief jailer.
Who were you told that by?
Just, I don't know.
Okay, so you
So I
confronted,
just asked him on the phone
and what was his response?
that he was not with Todd Davidson, but he has been offered a position.
Okay. Do you think that an appropriate conversation to have with a subordinate?
I didn't see no problem with it. James and I have been friends for probably 28, 29 years.
Thank you for watching another Lakeway Audits video. Today is October the 7th, 2021, and today we have something different. Today we have a hearing based on a Hamblen County, Tennessee Sheriff Deputy that got fired from being a deputy for using what was called excessive force. Now, in this hearing, it is very long. It's a few hours long, and I'm going to put it in its entirety up now so people can view it. But I will go ahead and I will make different parts based on each of the witnesses. There's a lot of good information if you're interested in knowing the workings and how policies and procedures and what kind of training our deputies have had in the Hamblen County Sheriff's Department, which is pretty much pretty standard across the nation. So you will see in this video Sheriff Esco Jarnigan states on record that there was discussion about Deputy Coffey resigning from the department before any other legal actions would incur, and given that options. And Deputy Coffey felt strongly enough that he was in his right, according to the policy, to use the force that he did. So he refused the resignation, and they ended up firing him, and now they sent the complaint, since the person that was incarcerated at the time and the incident was with decided not to press charges. They sent the information to the DA, and the DA sent it to the grand jury, and they have indicted him. So this video shows you a lot of things, just like how the Sheriff's Department gives opportunity to their deputies to resign so that they are not held accountable for their actions. This is the same situation that happened 2 months ago in the Morristown Police Department with Officer Matthew Johnson. He resigned the following day after doing an unlawful arrest on a person seeking mental health treatment, and you can watch that video on my page. There's an update and then the video in its entirety. Both great footage, information to look at. But what you will see here, and I'm not going to make any judgment because they didn't come with a ruling today, but what you will gather and you will see is that lack of training, lack of knowledge of what the policy is, verbiage used in the policy that is open to personal interpretation, and the word that you will see utilized often in this video is the word care. To give care, what is the word meaning of care? What kind of force incurs the word care? So you will see that they utilize verbiage also to protect themselves, but there is no protection when it really comes down to personal interpretation of a meaning. And if there is no outline on that meaning, it should be null and void. But this is policy we're talking about. So you guys watch the video. You all be the judge, the jury. I will go ahead and in my segmented posting of this video, there will be contact information for everybody. But this video here is going to be strictly in its entirety. It's a couple of different videos that I have to put together because we took recess and lunch, and so everything will be put together one shot. You'll see it from beginning to end. It's not like the typical other videos that I have, but man, the corruption, the cover-up, the lack of intelligence, the lack of duty to the citizens, the lack of duty to employees not being properly trained or significantly trained or trained often enough is a big problem, and you can see that in my videos. So sit back and enjoy. It's kind of a disgrace and embarrassment to consider myself part of Hamblen County, and you will see why here shortly. My other videos show it too, but this is actually the inside dealings.
Sure. Everybody's going to be a witness in this case. Stand up and hold up your right hand, please. Do you, in each of you, swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do, yes. The rule's been requested, so everyone other than Mr. Coffey and the sheriff will need to wait outside. When you're outside, do not discuss your testimony after you testify. You cannot tell anybody out there what occurred in the courtroom. Thank you.
We'll call Captain Teresa Wallace.
We got somebody that'll go get the witness. I think we're going to put the witness right here. Or would it be better here? It'd be more full.
I'm really either way.
All right, that matters.
I'm listening more than I'm looking, so.
You are Captain Teresa Laws,
Yes,
and I'm going to refer to you as Captain Laws, if that's okay.
that's fine.
Captain Laws, you are the captain and the chief jailer at the Hamblen County Jail, is that correct?
Correct.
And how long have you been in that position?
In this position, probably 11, 12 years.
And Lieutenant, I'm going to refer to the felon as Lieutenant Coffey. That's okay as well. Lieutenant Coffey worked in the jail for you for how many years now?
Well, Coffey's been there pretty well after he left, about 28 months since I've been there. But as far as I knew, maybe in this capacity, he came back while I was his jail administrator, so ever since he's been back before he left, also I guess.
Now, were you familiar with his rank when he left the jail for a period of time?
I think he was a sergeant when he left.
And
was here.
indicating to me that he left for a period of time, was that about a little over 2 years?
I think it was 28 months, yes.
Okay. And did he return to the jail after that 28-month period as a sergeant, to your knowledge?
I'm thinking he come back on day shift and then went to night shift as a sergeant, because he did, is how I'm thinking it was. But I think for a little while it was a day shift.
Okay. And since he came back as a sergeant, has he been elevated to the position of lieutenant?
Yes, he has.
And has he worked night shift during his time after coming back from the period where he was not with the jail?
As sergeant on the shift, he worked a 12-hour night shift. When he went come into lieutenant, he worked pretty well at 3 or 11, 36 set shift, 5 days a week.
And in addition to being elevated to the position of lieutenant, did he also receive a county vehicle in connection with his position? And could you describe a little bit for the board what his duties were at night when he was working there at the jail?
He was a lieutenant, being more over the 2 shifts that was on, and just pretty well run the shift.
Was he fairly much in charge of the shift during his time at the jail?
Yes, as his position, he would have been the man to go to from the sergeant or even the employees.
Was he the highest ranking person there in the jail in your absence?
Yes, he was.
And did you become aware of an incident allegedly occurring on June 21st of this year in the jail during his shift?
Yes, I did become aware of it.
And how did you become aware of that?
I guess at first was probably reading the reports, offense reports at night that, I don't know, I read it the next morning I came in, or I cannot recall on that.
Okay, so let me ask you about that, now that you've mentioned it. If there is a quote incident in the jail, and officers on shift required to make a report of that incident.
Yes.
And to your knowledge, did Mr. Coffey or Lieutenant Coffey make such a report after the incident on the 21st of June of this year?
As I recall, yes, he did.
We show this our court reporter for Martinez for identification. See if I can. Could I ask you to stand and read this over to you, please, man? Mr. Gibbs, you have a copy of that?
I do, thank you.
Okay. Captain Laws, is that a copy of the incident report prepared or entered by Mr. Coffey, I believe, on June 21st of this year?
Yes, that does look like a copy of the report.
And in that report, you can identify that as the report made by Mr. Coffey on that day, correct?
Correct.
Can we mark it to be our exhibit number 1?
No objection.
Could you, without reading it word for word, could you tell our board what Mr. Coffey says occurred in that incident there with a gentleman by the name of Mr. Corey Kyle?
I think it was moving bunts and Corey Cowan refused, and it says that he was making threats, and Corey Cowan was removed from the dorm. He was going to be moved to another block, and it says I, Lieutenant Coffey, then struck inmate Kyle and was then escorted up front and placed in the holding cell.
So in that document, there was admission of the striking of an inmate, correct?
Faithful to the characterization.
Very well.
Whatever it says, right.
Could we pass that to the board?
Sure. Hand it to me all. I'll start with his hand. All right, it's behind you.
As a result of reading that incident report, did you take any action to follow up on that report?
Well, I read the report. As far as seeing an incident report with something physical happen, it's not like it. Later on, I was made aware of the video. I think I even, as I recall right, I kept copies of it about it, which I knew it was going to. Then the video was burnt, or recalled.
Let me ask you if it's okay if the witnesses are able to remove their masks, because it's
I don't have any of that.
difficult for me to hear, and I think for everybody, frankly. Maybe the reporter will have a better job of it also.
Appreciate it.
Okay, my question was, did you take any action after having read the report regarding this physical incident?
The report was reviewed, the video was reviewed, Corey called in, wrote out a statement that he felt like he was assaulted and wanted to place charges. Then the report, whenever it was brought to me, I'm like, take this farther on upstairs. We're not gonna deal with it down here, an officer in the jail. We're going to take it elsewhere to be investigated.
You mentioned the report, or a couple.
Or the video.
Well, I'm gonna get to the video,
Okay,
but I wanna back you up just a little bit. You mentioned a complaint or something received from the inmate that
Correct.
you wanted to do something about being struck, is that right?
That is correct.
And did you read a complaint form that he prepared?
Yes.
Can I pass that to you and ask if you can identify that? And I've already provided Mr. Gibbons a copy of that as well. Is that a complaint form that you recognize as having read from Mr. Kyle?
I think the one that I really recall reading was the one that was wrote on the kiosk to where you can communicate with the supervisor, inmates in the park. I may have seen this one, but this is not the total one I'm referring to. I'm talking about the one that came across the kiosk.
So we're talking about something that was electronically sent to you, correct?
It was sent to Officer Marcy, I think.
Okay. We'll ask Officer Marcy about that. I can retrieve that. We're not gonna admit it.
Hand that back to Mr. Gibbons.
You said you sent it upstairs, and what you're saying, you were talking about a video, is that right?
Correct.
And at what point did you ask Mr. Marcy or Officer Marcy to retrieve a videotape if there was one of this occurrence?
Yes, I did.
And did he do that for you?
Yes, he did.
And did he bring that to you, and did you view it?
I viewed the video and decided then that it needed to be investigated elsewhere.
And so you sent it up to Sheriff Jarnigan, is that correct?
Well, it usually goes to the detectives or Chief Miles first, and then it's decided where it goes from there.
To your knowledge, did the sheriff and or chief deputy take any action as a result of having viewed that video?
Yes, it was decided it would go to the DA's office, and then as my recollection while the sheriff saw the video, that's when it was determined, he made determination to terminate.
Does the sheriff's department typically do its own investigations of situations like this, or do you know?
If it involves officers within the department, it is to the nature of what the investigation may be, and a lot of times it's took on to the DA's office to be investigated.
As opposed to the sheriff's office
Yes.
investigating? Let me hand you this document. This is the termination form given to Mr. Coffey, which Mr. Gibbons has also been provided. Ask if you can identify that document.
Yes, I can.
And if you look at the back page, does that document bear your signature?
Yes, it does.
And does it also bear the signature of Chief Mize?
Yes.
If we could mark that as number 2.
No objection. What is it again?
The termination form. document, having put your signature on it, correct?
Yes.
And does that document, indicate that Mr. Coffey was being terminated for fault, for conduct unbecoming,
Correct, yes, it does.
among a number of other items, correct?
Yes.
Ask that that be passed to the board.
Court reporter, go ahead and.
Yes, if we, I think we asked that that be marked, but I don't think it got.
I'm watching, I got the list, when it makes its way down here, I'll put the number on it.
Ms. Laws, as Captain Laws, as the chief jailer there, the Hamblen County Jail, you're familiar with the guidelines, both for use of force and for how officers are to conduct themselves. Is that true?
Yes, I am.
And in fact, we have a handbook about 2 inches thick which contains those items. Is that also true?
Yes.
Are the officers asked to, are they trained with that book, and those are the rules and guidelines that they're to follow?
Yes, they used to be given a book, now they're given a thumb drive with the policy and procedure on it.
In that jail policies and procedures, does it have guidelines for when and how force is to be used and in response to different types of situations?
Yes, it does.
Captain Laws, answer any questions that Mr. Gibbons may have.
Are you gonna introduce the guidelines?
I'm going to do so.
Okay.
I'm gonna ask. Okay. Mr. Chairman, do you mind if I use the podium?
No, go ahead.
I'll remove my mask when I'm out.
That's fine.
Ms. Laws, my name's Link Gibbons, and I represent Mr. James Coffey in this hearing today. What are your primary duties as the captain of the jail?
My primary duties is running of the jail, over the officers, totally running the jail.
Okay. And are you responsible for disciplining employees underneath your control?
Yes, I am.
Prior to being captain, what was your job title?
Prior to being captain, are we talking about through the ranks or?
What was your last job held prior to captain?
I was lieutenant.
Okay. Did you ever serve as a corrections officer?
No, I did not.
Okay. Why not?
I came in as about 20 years ago, close to 20 years, no, 18 years ago, I was just working part-time with the jail administrator, and then eventually, when I got on full-time, and I've been familiar with the jail routine as far as work as correctional officer. No, I did not.
Okay. And so you were an administrator, and then what was your next job duty that you went into?
Well, that's when it was made as far as the civil service was, it even then, the civil service was put in, and I think it was put in, I think I had went full-time before we was placed in. And it was decided I could test for ranks as far as administration, I guess.
Okay. And so, since you did not serve as a corrections officer, what experience do you have dealing with these inmates prior to being named lieutenant?
I've had experience dealing with inmates since I came into the jail.
Okay. And what experience was that?
When the previous jail administrator told me in on anything going on that had to do with the running of the jail, the administration, not just administration part of the inmates, the COs, the correctional officers,
The hands-on duties, you have to remove inmates and move inmates, that's.
have if I was ever a part of it, I always had an officer there with me, no doubt about that.
Okay.
But I've not shied away from duties.
And then I'm not
I
implying, so
understand that, I do, I understand what you're saying.
just trying to get an idea of your background prior to, when were you appointed as the captain of the jail?
When the previous jail administrator retired, and I'm thinking I'm gonna say that was 11 years ago.
You were previously presented with the employee termination form, which has been entered as exhibit number 2. Who drafted that document?
Jim Miles did.
Okay. And is that his normal role and responsibility, or is that something the sheriff typically does? How does that normally work?
Well, I think it's according to the whole situation and considering the rank and James working directly with me, for me, it was decided the chief, it was decided chief the determination form.
Was Chief Mines the one who decided on the reasons for Mr. Coffey's termination, or was that Sheriff Johnson?
I cannot answer that question. I wasn't up there at the time the draft he was drafting.
Okay. Well, when you signed the document, did you agree with the allegations that were contained in the document?
Yes, conduct unbecoming, yeah, I had no reason not to agree with it.
What was it that Mr. Coffey did that was unbecoming?
Striking an inmate with his hands full, that showed, I mean, his hands were full. He looked pretty compliant as far as what I've seen of it.
Did you speak to any of the other COs that were there that night?
Had I spoke to him, I was gonna, I can imagine, I cannot tell you that, I cannot answer yes or no on that, I don't.
As you sit here today, you
A
don't.
possibility, I don't know.
Okay. As you sit here today, you don't recall specifically speaking to any of the other COs though?
Not really, not just specifically speaking to them.
Wouldn't that be important before you made a determination, since there's no audio on the video, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And did Mr. Coffey report to you that Mr. Kyle was cursing him and accusing him of being racist?
I'm thinking that's even in his report, something to that extent.
So you were aware that was the allegations that Mr. Coffey made against Mr. Kyle, correct?
I'm thinking that's in the report.
Okay. And so even though you knew those allegations were made by Mr. Coffey, well, let me ask you, if that was true, would that show Mr. Kyle being non-compliant? He's making accusations, cursing an officer, calling him a racist. Does that tend to make you believe that he was being compliant?
I wouldn't call it compliant, I don't call it aggressive.
Well, would you call it non-compliant?
They're inmates. I mean, a mouth is something you ought to put up with, name calling, whatever.
I understand, but I'm simply asking you, would that demonstrate compliant behavior or non-compliant behavior in your experience as captain?
I would say it's non-compliant, really, as far as totally.
Have you been trained in use of force continuum in your duties as the captain?
I have been trying, as far as knowing what they are and knowing the guidelines to go by, yes,
Okay. How many levels are on the use of force continuum?
they're 5.
Okay. And if an inmate is being non-compliant, what level would that be?
Well, that's just the extent of what it might be. You're going with compliant and you're going with passive, which is directing them, maybe even taking on or going to active, which is getting. And then you're going to defensive tactics is what I figure he jumped from 1 to 4, or well, at least 2 to 4, if not 1 to 4.
What's 4? What?
4 is defensive tactics, which it can come down to fist or whatever.
Okay. There's no allegation that Mr. Coffey struck Mr. Collins with a fist, right?
That the video speaks for itself. I cannot make a determination if it's an open hand or a fist.
Okay. I'm simply asking you, are you aware of any allegations that Mr. Coffey struck Mr. Kyle with a fist?
I am. I think the report said an open hand.
Even Mr. Davis's own complaint said he slapped him, correct?
I think so.
And an open hand use of force is not a level 4, it's a level 3, isn't it?
An open hand use of force.
Yes, ma'am.
Level 3. That's good. I would say yes.
Okay. So did you misspeak earlier whenever you said that he jumped from a level 2 to a level 4?
Well, it's going, I guess, if it is an open hand or fist. I don't know, striking an inmate to what, or
You don't know what? I'm sorry.
I don't know, striking an inmate with open hand or a fist. I don't.
Well, there's a difference between the two, definitely, in the use of
Okay.
force, correct?
I don't know if it has an open hand.
You're not familiar with that?
As far as me reading word by word, no, I cannot read it word by word. If it specifies slapping with an open hand as a difference as a hitting, then no, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, so you don't know one way or the other?
As far as that right there, no, I don't know, because there's a distinction between it.
And you are the head person over the jail, and you don't know if there's a difference on the use of force continuum, is that your testimony?
I do not believe there is a difference between an open hand and a fist. It's a strike is a strike.
Okay. What does a level 3 response include?
It could, I'm thinking pepper spray, use of restraints,
What about rough physical force?
rough physical force.
What is rough physical force?
Probably jerking somebody's arms back behind their back, put them in handcuffs. I would consider that to be rough physical force. Taking control of the inmate.
Would an open-handed slap be considered rough physical force? Under the use of force continuum as you have been trained?
An open hand.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to interpose an objection at this point, because there are two different things that we're talking about. The level of force in response to a particular stimulus from the inmate. To separate the two, if the inmate is resisting, the inmate is, there needs to be a distinction drawn, because you can't just address one without addressing the other. The level of force has to be together with whatever resistance there is.
You're going to object to the speaking objections.
Let me go ahead.
Sure.
I mean, whatever that document says, it says. I think he's just questioning her about her knowledge, and I think that's relevant. Objection.
Just to be clear, not to get too far astray, a level 3 officer's perception deals with individuals that are being actively resistant, correct? Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Okay. And then in response to that, an officer is supposed to use no more than level 3 force as the reasonable officer's response under the use of force continuum, correct?
In response, repeat that.
Yes, an officer is not supposed to exceed the level 3 use of force if an individual is only being actively resistant, correct? They go hand in hand, as Mr.
Right.
Gaps kind of pointed out here. So if an inmate's been actively resistant, an officer should reply or respond with level 3 force, use of force, correct? Okay. And that's all I'm trying to establish.
Okay.
And so, at this point in time, it's your testimony, you don't know whether an open hand slap is a level 3 response.
No, I do not know as far as the difference.
And you don't know if there's a difference between an open-handed slap and a hard fist. Is that your testimony?
I would assume that yes, honestly, I do not know that.
Would you agree that a hard fist is a level 4 response?
Yes, I would.
Would you agree that an open-handed slap is rough physical force as provided for under level 3 of the use of force continuum?
Well, I think that's according to using force to a point.
Well, the use of force continuum is not an arbitrary standard. It's an objective standard that officers are trained by, correct?
Right.
And so my question to you is, would an open hand slap be qualified as rough physical force under level 3 pursuant to the sheriff's
Yes,
policy?
it could, yes, it could.
Okay. And so if an inmate is being actively resistant, then an appropriate response would be a level 3 use of force. Is that accurate?
I would think so, yes.
And an open-handed slap, you've already testified, would fall as a level 3 officer response to be an actively resistant inmate, correct? Okay. Did you speak, and you've already said you don't remember or don't recall speaking to any other COs to determine whether or not Mr. Kyle was being actively resistant or what his level of non-compliance was. Is that accurate?
No, I do not recall.
Okay. Did you ever read Corrections Officer Chris Davis' statement about the incident that evening?
Yes.
Okay. What do you recall about that statement?
I know as far as, I think they had an issue inside the pod. This is outside the pod, and that he'd been non-compliant, I guess.
Okay.
But as far as what he wrote totally the statement, I do not recall. I haven't read it for a while.
All right, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Ms. Laws, I'd ask you to take a look at this statement. Have you seen this document before?
I don't recall if I've seen this or I've seen on the kiosk what was wrote on the kiosk.
Okay. Well, regardless of what you read, whether it was on the kiosk or whether it was on this form, does it appear that that's Officer Davis's signature?
I would think so, yes.
I'm reading part of this. It says, Lieutenant or LT Coffey cussing him, or excuse me, let me back up. I'm gonna have to read it this way. You make sure I read it correctly. It says on 6/21/21, Lieutenant Coffey gave us a layout of how the bunks and inmates on the floor was going to go. So when we entered annex, I was the one that approached inmate Kyle and told him he needed to get up and move to his right spot. And if he had a problem with it, I'd move him to the slams. He gets up and said a few words, then threw his stuff down and head straight toward It says cussing, I'll tell you, and that's marked out. Lieutenant Coffey cussing him and calling him a racist and other names. So Lieutenant Coffey told him to get his things and get out, but Mr. Kyle kept on disrespecting and refused to follow Lieutenant Coffey's directive. As Coffey was helping him get the annex, Mr. Kyle tripped on his mat, causing him to go to one knee on the mat while outside the annex. Mr. Kyle was still being disrespectful to Lieutenant Coffey. Then Lieutenant Coffey and I escorted him to the holding cell. End of statement. Did I read that accurately?
Yes.
Okay. I'd ask that this document be entered as exhibit number 3. Now, so based on Mr. Chris Davis's statement, when he says that inmate Kyle was cussing and calling Mr. Coffey, Lieutenant Coffey, a racist and other names, and he refused to follow his directives, would you agree that that would be, or at least under the rules of being the use of force continuum, does that describe conduct that appears or sounds to be actively resistant?
Because you're calling somebody names. That, to me, it's not active resistance.
Okay. What if you're not, if Lieutenant Coffey was giving orders, commands for him to get up, to move his things, and he refused to do that, and in return, he starts cursing him, he starts calling him a racist, and refuses to follow his commands? Would that be actively resistant to you?
I think that's more toward passive resistance.
Okay. What do you define as passive resistance?
Giving them a direct command to do, and maybe failing to do so, taking control of the arm or something, or maybe like holding hands up your back, and, maybe shoving back a little bit or something. Just passive, no aggression toward.
What if this individual, an inmate, is coming towards the officer whenever he's giving him a command and he's coming towards him in an aggressive manner? Is that being actively resistant?
If he's coming toward him in an aggressive manner, and I can see that being active, yes.
Okay. Would a shove be warranted in that situation?
Well, it's according if your hands are full of your stuff or whatever, or are you coming toward ready with what kind of stamp you've got, or are you coming toward with your stuff? Or I think it would be according to the manner of what you come toward you.
Okay. Can you agree that it would be a reasonable officer's perception that was in the situation? Because in that use of force continuum, specifically says you can't look back in hindsight, correct?
Right.
You have to put yourself in the moment.
Yeah, I mean,
We can't second guess an officer's perception at that time unless there was obviously an excessive use of force, correct?
right.
My question to you is, if the situation occurred as Officer Davis described it, and as Officer or Lieutenant Coffey described it, would it be reasonable that he could perceive that as being actively resistant?
And I think that's what it stands into, and whether he has his hands full of his belongings or.
My question simply to you is, could that be a reasonable perception from an officer that was in the moment, as described by Officer Davis and by Lieutenant Coffey?
It could be a reasonable, yes.
Okay. And then rough physical force would be a reasonable response to that behavior from an inmate, correct? We've already described that on the use of force continuum, correct?
The video I saw, there was no aggression
We're gonna get to the video, but I'm asking you to answer my question.
As far as what could he proceed? I think it's according to the stance of the inmate,
But as it's described by Officer Davis and by Lieutenant Coffey, you've already agreed to me that it could be perceived as being actively resistant, correct?
correct,
And in response to that, you're allowed to use rough physical force, is that right?
correct,
And we've already established that rough physical force can be an open hand slap because that's a level 3, whereas a hard fist is a level 4, correct?
correct. I don't even know that it specifies a hand, but I'm assuming.
Are you familiar with policy 8.1 of the Hamblen County Sheriff's Department?
If you want me to say I remember the policy procedure book, I would have to look at it.
Okay. I'm gonna permission to approach.
Okay, can we see the proof?
I'm sorry. You might just hand up, Mr. Johnson, thank you. Permission to approach?
Yes.
I'm showing you, Ms. Long, what has been provided to us as Hamblen County Jail Policies and Procedures Policy 8.1. Do you recognize this document?
Yes.
I'd ask that this document be admitted as exhibit number 4. If you don't mind, I'm gonna let the court reporter mark it, and I'm gonna ask you a few questions, okay? Thank you. This document, is it accurately, is it the current version of this policy as far as you know?
As far as I know, yes.
Okay. I'm gonna ask you to look on page 3 of the document. And it describes the different levels of general perception and corresponding force options. Is that correct?
Yes.
We've gone through a couple of those. The one I'm going to focus on is what we've discussed as being actively resistant. And then those things that the officer can do in response to, and that does appear to be level 3 under this policy. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. It says the inmate is perceived by the officer to be actively resistant. The appropriate response is compliance techniques. This is the threshold for any reasonable officer to consider this inmate to be a dangerous threat to himself, officers, and other inmates. Compliance techniques may include all reasonable means to bring the inmate into compliance as soon as reasonably possible. These techniques may include use of chemical weapons, use of restraints, forced movement, forcing an inmate's limbs behind his back, forcing an inmate down on the floor or against the wall, or using other forms of rough physical force, etc. Once inmates are perceived as actively resistant, officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. Did I read that accurately?
Yes, you do.
In level 4, however, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it specifically describes that defensive tactics may include impact weapons, hard fist, or any other reasonable means of action. Is that right?
That's correct.
So, after having reviewed this policy, can you say with certainty that there is a difference between a hard fist and an open slap?
I would think so, yes.
Okay. Open slap's level 3, hard fist level 4.
Yes.
You might hand that to the Mr. Johnson. Were you familiar with Richard Ford Call prior to this incident?
Yes.
He's a frequent flyer at the jail. Isn't he?
I've known him ever since I seen him.
How many times have you been to the cross?
25, 20, I can't tell you.
It's been a lot of that,
It's
correct?
been quite a few years.
And is he usually give trouble to the officer?
When he comes in, usually,
It's hard to deal with, isn't it?
a lot of times, yes.
Do you have any doubt that he was cursing and calling Mr. Coffey a racist based on their allegations, but does that sound typical of the conduct that you observed from Mr. Kyle?
Honestly, yes.
John, can we play the video? I'm not sure how I need to go about doing it. Looks like we got someone that can help. We got to thank you.
Sheriff, you're gonna have to move right around. Kev, you're okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't gonna say that.
Might be up to you.
Can we turn that towards you all a little bit?
That would be good to
Leave
see.
it, that's you all. Get Josh. Get Josh. That's it. You may need to come up closer. I don't know how that's going to appear. Your ability to see.
Shut that line over a little bit.
Can we stipulate, Mr. Gibbons, that Mr. Marcy, was responsible for pulling that video and bringing that and putting it here for us today?
I assume.
I was gonna call him to authenticate.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that.
Very good.
Which one do you want to see first?
Let's see the bunk.
Someone turn off the lights.
Yeah.
Now this has an extra view that I've not seen before. Mine only had 2 views on it.
I couldn't get it to play in mine. I had to take it to the sheriff's department to view it.
Okay.
So I can't. I don't think I saw this either. Make it more than what we did.
Now it's my understanding, Ms. Laws, that, and it's a little grainy, but Mr. Coffey is right here. He had a clipboard in his hand. Is that correct? If you need to come forward.
Yes, I think it appears so, yes. Paper or clipboard or something.
You had testified earlier that that we're going to rearrange the sleeping arrangements. Is that the
That
vote?
was what I was told.
Okay.
I wasn't there at the time.
I think it's about 1809 where there's some interaction there.
I started it.
Okay. All right, and can we pause that for a second? That's Mr. Kyle, is that correct? If you need to move forward again, you're welcome to come forward. Mr. Kyle was in this corner. Can we rewind that just a minute?
It looks like it.
Okay. Sure. All right, so I'm going to watch Mr. Kyle come out of the corner. His first interaction with these officers. Right there. Stop it for a second. He points his finger at him and approaches in an aggressive manner. Would you agree to that characterization?
He points his finger at him and comes toward him, yes.
In a quick, aggressive manner, correct?
Correct, he does.
Okay. We can go ahead and stop there. He's in the officer's face. He's still pointing, right?
He is pointing, yes.
Okay. It doesn't appear that Mr. Coffey's being overly aggressive or anything at this point, correct?
No.
He's He's now giving them commands, it appears, right? We don't know for certain from the video, but it appears he's giving them some commands, correct?
He's telling him something, I have no
And
idea.
he's
what
pointed,
saying.
correct? He goes back over to him and it's cut off for a period of time. Then he hands the clipboard right off to the other officer, correct?
Yes.
So at that point in time, if he's giving them commands, he's approached in a quick, aggressive manner, he's pointed in their face, would he be reasonable in using a level 3 response with rough physical force? If he's being actively resistant?
That is a hard question to answer. I don't feel like I can sit here and make a determination of how active resistant he has been. I can't say one way or the other.
Right.
Because I don't know what's been said.
But you have. You made a decision. You signed off on that termination document, correct?
Correct, I did.
Okay. And even as you sit here today, with the advantage of hindsight, you see how Mr. Kyle interacts, and you're still having the difficulty determining what level of response is justified, correct?
I would think, you can go from one level to another in a heartbeat.
Right. And if an inmate's acting in an aggressive manner, pointing his fingers, not responding to commands, pursuant to the use of force continuum, that would constitute being actively resistant. Correct?
Yes.
And rough physical force, including shoving and even an open hand slap, would be justified in response to being actively resistant, as we've already established and gone through. Correct?
Well, it don't specify an open hand slap, but it's perception of how you.
But you would agree that's a level 3 response. We've already established that through your testimony previously, right?
Okay? Yes.
Would you agree with that? Ma'am?
It's taking control of the situation, yes.
Okay, thank you. You'll go ahead. And as I read earlier, when you engage in rough physical force, I'm gonna get out of the way here. The policy says officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. That's the policy,
What
correct?
section are you reading?
Page 3, under level 3, the last sentence.
Okay.
Once inmates are perceived as actively resistant, officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. That's the policy, right, Ms. Walls? Or Captain Walls?
That is, to my recollection, yes, what you're reading.
So once you begin rough physical force, there will be some right there with the pushes them outside the door. Pursuant to the Sheriff's Department's own policy, he's not to relax care until that inmate is in an isolated cell.
That is what policy says, states.
Thank you. We can look at the annex view here, or excuse me, the hallway view. That's Officer Davis, it appears, is that right?
That does appear to be Officer Davis.
Okay, he's placing Mr. Kyle's things outside. There's a slap, open-handed slap there, correct?
That would be correct.
Okay. He's already exerted rough physical force previously.
But where does he stop at?
Well, he stops when he puts him in an isolated cell, is what the policy says, correct?
Well, he should have took him on to the isolated cell.
Well, is he giving him commands? We don't know at this point, right?
I don't know what's been said.
We know what was described by Lieutenant Coffey. Throws down his things here, points in his face, correct?
That is correct.
Is that aggressive behavior? Ma'am, is that aggressive behavior? When he throws things down and gets in his face and points again? Coffey's not beating on him, is he?
At this time, no, he's not whatsoever.
He's exerted rough physical force as pursuant to the company policy. We don't have the advantage of audio, but we do have the advantage of statements from Lieutenant Coffey and Lieutenant Davis. He's still being visibly excited and flailing the arms and pointing, correct?
At this time, yes. That's how poor Kyle talks with his hands a lot.
But you would agree that could be viewed as an aggressive behavior?
Right now, I don't see aggressive behavior other than,
That didn't appear to be aggressive behavior to you? Once the situation was de-escalated, they let him off to an isolated cell. I think they actually put him in the drunk tank, didn't they?
as I recall, yes.
Okay. And would that constitute an isolated cell?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So we've established there was aggressive behavior from Mr. Kyle as being actively resistant, as you described, as you agreed with. Mr. Coffey responded with rough physical force in shoving and open-handed slap under level 3 pursuant to sheriff's policy, correct? That's sheriff's policy.
Policy, yes.
And then he also followed policy because he wasn't to relax that until he gets him into an isolated cell, and that's ultimately what happened, wasn't it?
I see inside the pod was aggressive behavior. Outside the pod, I do not see the aggressive behavior as with a man with his hands full.
Once he's exerted rough physical force from an actively resistant inmate, the sheriff's policy says he is to continue until he's placed in an isolated cell. We've already agreed upon that, right?
That is what the policy says, yes.
And he was placed in an isolated cell after he exerted rough physical force. They removed him from the pod and ultimately put him in that isolated cell, correct?
That is correct.
I don't have anything else I want to show from this, but I would like for it to be made exhibit number 5.
I'm gonna cross with some video.
Yeah. Very good. So that'd be exhibit 5.
Right. Uh-huh.
Let's leave that up now.
Okay. Can we turn the lights back on for just a second?
And then stepping out.
Yeah, if you don't mind, yeah.
His own, unless you're gonna call him, or you plan to call him?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Captain Laws, are you?
There was some testimony earlier about the matter being referred to the DA's office.
Correct.
Okay. There is an internal affairs detective that handles these type of matters, correct?
Yes, it is.
And who is that?
Bob Ellis.
Okay. Bob Ellis is the detective with.
You're talking about the sheriff's department?
Yes, ma'am.
The sheriff's department would be more than likely a detective, I would say.
James Brooks, correct?
I'm thinking it is, yes.
Okay. And, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Do you know if James Brooks investigated this matter?
I do not know as far as upstairs who's picking up.
Do you know if James Brooks declined to take any action as far as referring it to the DA after reviewing the incident?
No, I do not. I don't know.
You don't know one way or the other?
I do not know.
At some point in time, did you and Josh Morrissey meet with Mr. Kyle?
Meet with Mr. Kyle?
Yes, ma'am, about these allegations. You recall Mr. Bobby Tharp bringing the inmate to you, and you met with Mr. Kyle, you and Josh Morrissey?
If Bobby Thorpe brought him to us, I'm assuming yes.
I'm just asking you as you sit here today, do you recall speaking to Mr. Kyle about these allegations, a meeting with him, with Mr. Morrissey present as well as yourself?
I probably did. I bet.
Do you have any recollection of that meeting?
Honestly, right out. If he wrote it out of statement on the kiosk and whatever, more likely I probably did.
Okay. Do you remember what was discussed at all?
I'm thinking, for me to say even what was said in the meeting, I know he was determined to, he wanted to charge his place against Mr. Coffey for assault.
He's raised complaints in the past, though, correct? Mr. Kyle?
Has he raised complaints in the past?
Yes, ma'am.
Most of his complaints are medical than anything, if his medical needs to be met.
Has he raised any complaints against other officers in the past? About being mistreated or anything of that nature?
For me to say some specific officer, I cannot tell you.
Okay, that's fine, I'm just asking.
Possibility, yes, I'm sure, I don't know.
You just don't recall one way or
I
the
don't
other?
know no specific officer who it might be.
Okay. I don't have any additional questions at this time.
Mr. Cat? Yes. Captain Laws, let me redirect your attention to Mr. Coffey's statement. If I could, I think that was probably exhibit number 1 or 2 on. We can hand that back to you if I could. Let me direct your attention down to where it starts with inmate Kyle then started pointing his finger at myself. You see that?
Let's see, make that sign. In person. Yeah.
Is there any mention in Mr. Coffey or Lieutenant Coffey's statement of any attempts to strike him by Mr. Kyle at any time?
It says inmate Kyle then struck inmate Kyle with an open hand to de-escalate the situation.
Is there any mention in Lieutenant Coffey's statement that Mr. Kyle had attempted to assault him, Lieutenant Coffey, at any point?
To assault him, I don't think to assault him, no.
And is there any mention in Lieutenant Coffey's statement that at the time that the striking was done, that Mr. Kyle had his hands full of his personal property?
No, I don't think that is mentioned in here.
Were you able to see the video?
Yes.
And that in fact were Mr. Kyle's hands filled with his personal property at the time of the striking?
Yes, as in the process of moving.
So he didn't have his hand in Mr. Lieutenant Coffey's face at the time of the striking, correct?
No, absolutely not, no.
He was not moving towards Mr. Coffey in an aggressive fashion at the time of the striking, was he?
No.
And Mr. Davis was not in the picture, if I recall, at the time of the striking.
No.
And I believe you indicated that you had read Mr. Davis's statement. earlier, correct? Mr. Gibbons asked you about having read it.
I know I read the one on the kiosk, as far as the handwritten one, I really don't recall, I'll tell you 100% that I had read it, or the one that come apart was, I'm thinking was on the kiosk from Mr. Davis.
He's asked you about the particular levels of force that were required in response to, quote, active resistance.
Okay.
And would you characterize standing in the hallway holding your personal property? Mr. Gibbons has characterized that as active resistance beginning and continuing until he's...
I didn't characterize it as that. That's what she...
You asked him. I'll take out, withdraw that.
Okay, just ask her what you're doing.
Is there in the guideline, or is it appropriate, within your knowledge of the use of force in the jail, to strike an inmate when they are standing holding their personal property in their hands?
Absolutely not.
Did you see any reasonable need for that to occur in that video?
No, I did not.
Did you see any reasonable requirement for Mr. Coffey to defend himself by striking in that video?
At that time, no.
Level 2, the inmate is perceived by the officer to be passively resistant. And the appropriate level response is contact controls. Is that what you understand about level 2?
I'm thinking so, yes.
And what are contact controls?
You know, grab them, maybe holding their arm, guiding them up. If they get close to you or something, put your hands up your back. That's, you know, just soft contact, really.
So striking, you've indicated in answer to Mr. Gibbons' questions, is a proper response for level 3, active resistance, or level 4, to be assaulted, where the officer is being assaulted, correct?
Striking, yes.
He was not being assaulted by Mr. Kyle at the time.
No.
If the picture and the video is accurate, correct?
Correct.
Verbally, yes.
Correct.
Is it ever appropriate within the jail policy guidelines for an officer to strike an inmate when there's verbal abuse being given to the officer?
No, because that's no. Verbal is not a threat as far as.
Could we go back on the video both with Mr. Marcy?
Get Marcy there, Kim.
I got you. Sorry.
Go back to the video, Marcy. Go back to the video.
Back to the video where the striking occurred and where they come into the hallway. I'll back that up. Do you see any aggressive motion by Mr. Kyle at the time that he was just struck?
None whatsoever.
Can you tell whether it was with an open hand or otherwise from that?
Say 100%, no, I cannot say.
Can we look at that one more time? do you know how big Mr. Kyle is?
Yes, relevant.
Perception of a threat. How big was Mr. Kyle in your recollection?
Not a big guy,
Do you know?
no,
How tall?
he's shorter than Mr. Coffey, I don't know, not, I can't tell you exactly.
Okay, never mind. Can we back it up to see where Mr. Davis, can we see where Mr. Davis is when that occurs?
Can y'all see with the glare on it? Yeah.
Okay, all right, the door was. So Mr. Davis's statement that you read, either by the kiosk or by his written statement, did Mr. Davis indicate that he had seen any striking? Or do you remember?
I don't recall him saying striking, no.
Let's go forward to the pushing. When that push occurred right there, was Mr. Kyle taking any aggressive action towards Officer Lieutenant Coffey?
No, he wasn't,
Were his hands full with his personal property?
yes.
Okay, that's all.
Anything else?
I have a couple of follow-up. Need the video? No, sir. Thank you. Miss Rawls, there's nothing in that video that you're aware of, nor is there any allegation by Mr. Kyle or anyone else that says Mr. Coffey struck Mr. Kyle with a hard fist. That you're aware of, is there?
No,
There's no allegation of that.
not my recollection, no.
So although Mr. Cap says from the video you can't tell, we know that there was no hard fist because Mr. Kyle's own statement said it was a slap, correct?
I think so, yes.
James Coffey's own statement says it was a slap, correct?
Correct.
And we went through once active resistance has occurred and the officer has to apply force, rough physical force, pursuant to the Sheriff's Department's own policy, he is required not to relax care until that inmate is put into an isolated cell. Right?
That is what policy procedure states.
Policy further says on page 5 of document of policy 8.1, officers have no obligation to retreat or back down before resorting to approved use of force, including deadly force. Now, deadly force is not anywhere on the table, nor is level 4, correct? We're talking about level 3 here, right?
Yes.
And in order to use rough physical force, there's no requirement of being assaulted, as Mr. Capps alluded to. That's under level 4, right? In order to use a hard fist, you have to be assaultive or approached in an assaultive manner, correct? Pursuant to the Sheriff's Department policy.
I think the video speaks for itself. Pursuant to policy,
Pursuant to policy what?
I think the use of force de-escalated as totally as he came out and he was come back to the compliance to a point. And that's when you take him onto the cell.
He ultimately did take him to the cell. He was still being allowed, and he did have things in his hands, but he was still obviously acting in an aggressive manner. You said that was Mr. Kyle's behavior, that he speaks through his hands, and he's a loud person, he curses officers frequently, correct?
Not frequently, it's just when he's total upset and feels like he's not getting his way, I guess.
Whenever there's active resistance, there's no policy. And I'm not trying to beat a dead horse, but Mr. Coffey is within the bounds of the policy, within his rights, to use rough physical force and to continue using rough physical force until that inmate is in an isolated cell. Pursuant to policy.
Pursuant to policy.
Next witness.
Esco Jarnigan, Sheriff Esco Jarnigan.
And did I ask for that policy to be considered back in?
It was admitted.
Policy and procedure.
Number four. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think number 4.
I correctly state your name to be Sheriff Esco Jarnigan? Yes, sir. And you are the Sheriff of Hamblen County? Yes, sir. And as such, you are the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for Hamblen County? Yes, sir. And in being that Chief Law Enforcement Officer, it is your responsibility to make terminations and determinations regarding termination of employment, hiring, and those personnel and employee decisions. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. And did you become aware of this incident involving Mr. Coffey and Mr. Kyle at some point during the last few months? Yes, sir. And how did you become aware of it?
I had talked to Chief Wayne Mize. He had shared the information with me about the incident. I also talked with Captain Laws, and she asked me if I had seen the video, and I told her no. Furnished me a copy of the video.
And did you then see the entire video?
Yes, sir, I did.
You saw the video from the point where it began filming in the annex to the point where we're in the hallway and this incident took place between Lieutenant Coffey and Mr. Kyle.
I had not seen the video in the annex earlier. I had seen this video here.
Okay. And as a result of seeing this video, did you make a determination regarding Lieutenant Coffey's continued employment?
Yes, sir, I did.
And did you make your decision known to Chief Deputy Mize, whereupon he prepared a termination statement, and along with Captain Laws, they provided to Mr. Lieutenant Coffey this termination statement?
Yes, sir.
Can I hand you this and ask you to identify it? Please, we admitted that already. The termination statement.
So the incident
Number
report
2.
Oh, it's a two?
for the termination form. Yeah.
Well, that was just a copy. And do you recognize that as a termination statement given to Lieutenant Coffey as a result of this incident?
Yes, sir.
And can you you've heard a lot about use of force and continuing use of force where someone is actively resistant. Could you tell the board why you believe that this use of force was excessive and that it was unbecoming conduct by Lieutenant Coffey?
When I witnessed the video, I was trying to determine if there was any errors on anybody's behalf. And when I looked at the video, what I witnessed was an inmate standing with his hands full, arms full, whatever terminology you want to use, but he had his hands full. And what I observed was Lieutenant Coffey unexpectedly striking Mr. Coy Call about the face. It's unclear to me whether or not he used the fist or his open hand, but there's no question that, in my opinion, he sucker punched Mr. Call.
When you say sucker punch, you mean a striking that came from without any forewarning or notice or things like that?
Yes, sir. You sucker punch, everybody knows the definition that you don't see it coming.
Is it appropriate and within the guidelines of use of force to warn an individual of the use of force, of someone who's either passively resistant or actively resistant?
That's the discretion of the officer. I would never second guess an officer. I don't know what the conversation had been between the two of them, but the officer usually would have a verbal communication with the suspect, usually trying to get them to comply with their orders.
And after viewing the video and making the determination that you did you do anything further with regard to either investigating the circumstance or taking any further action on behalf of the sheriff's department?
Yes, sir, I did.
And then what was that?
I referred this situation to the district attorney's office.
And to your knowledge, have they taken any action on it?
Yes, sir, they have.
What action have they taken?
They investigated the situation, they looked at the video, and they presented the case to the grand jury of Hamblen County.
And did the grand jury take any action?
Yes, sir, they did.
What was that action?
They returned the true bill of assault.
Is being charged with an offense, is that being charged with a criminal offense, is that something that is a violation of the procedures and policies in the jail?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Gibbons has talked about a continuing resistance, active resistance or passive resistance, and Mr. Coffey's statement regarding this incident. Have you been made familiar with his statement?
Yes, sir.
Can I hand you a copy of it and ask if you can look at that? Based upon that statement and based upon what you have viewed in this video, do you consider the resistance, quote unquote resistance, to have been passive or active based upon the statement and based upon the video?
In my opinion, based on the video, I see no aggression or calm at the time he was struck.
Answer any questions, Mr. Gibbons may have. Sure, thank you.
Sheriff Jargon, do you know who drafted the termination form that was used as Mr. James Coffey?
Yes, sir.
Okay, who was that?
Chief Mines.
Is that normally something that Chief Mize handles for you whenever a termination decision was made?
Yes, sir.
Is there an internal affairs detective that handles these type of situations within the sheriff's department?
That's not exactly a question that I can answer. We have internal affairs that will investigate certain cases if I feel like they don't need to be bumped up to the district attorney's office.
Okay. And so do you know if Officer Detective Brooks was ever presented with this video or any evidence?
I do not know.
Would that be the person that would normally go to if everyone was done?
He would have no reason to, once I got involved, Counselor, he had no reason to be involved in this investigation because I requested that Van Armstrong's office look into the incident.
You testified that a true bill was returned for assault, that was misdemeanor assault, correct?
I think that's correct, yes.
Simple assault, right?
That's correct.
Okay. What's the, what kind of punishment does that carry with it?
Well, it's a violation of law. Most of the time, a simple assault will just carry a fine or a very small jail sentence.
Similar to a traffic violation, they're misdemeanors as well, right?
Yes.
Have the same punishment by law, up to 1129, but usually a fine, that sort of thing, correct?
Well, that's not for me to say, because that's usually a judge's decision. It varies.
I'm just saying, under the law, though, for misdemeanors, it's no more than 1129 cents correct?
Yes.
And so a simple assault is on the level of a traffic violation.
Yes.
Why do you feel it necessary to refer a simple assault that's on par with a traffic violation to the district attorney's office?
Because we difference of the players involved in the situation.
Can you explain that to me?
Sure. We have correction officers involved with inmates. The policy of the Hamblen County Sheriff's Department is to receive inmates and safely house them. When I watched this video, James Coffey struck a defenseless inmate that had his hands full. And that's the reason I was turned over to the district attorney's office, because you can't investigate your own department because it's a no-win situation.
Okay. And did I understand you correctly to say this is the only view that you reviewed prior to making that termination decision and referring it to the DA's office?
That's correct.
Okay. So you didn't watch the where the bonds are stored? What's that area?
Back at the slam.
Okay. You didn't watch that and see the interaction between James Coffey prior to this occurring, did you?
No, sir. And if I had seen it, in fact, I seen it today, I would not change my decision.
Okay. But would you agree with Ms. Law's testimony that at that point in time it appeared he was being actively resistant?
In the slam?
Yes, sir.
I could not say, because we house inmates that they don't play by the rules. If they did, they wouldn't be in jail.
Yes, sir.
Okay. That's the character of inmates. They are mouthy, but very seldom do they follow through with mouth whooping. They just run that mouth, they cuss, they use a lot of profanity, and but they very seldom carry through with that.
We saw in that video that one of Mr. Kyle's first interactions with Lieutenant Coffey, as well as the other COs, was he approaches in a very quick manner, aggressive manner, pointing his finger at the officers who are trying to give him commands and remove him from his location. Would you agree with that characterization?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And would you agree that that would constitute being actively resistant at that point if he has been commanded to move? He makes sudden approaches, aggressive approaches towards the officers. Would you agree that that would be being actively resistant?
No, sir.
Okay. And why not?
Because I don't know what the conversation was, and he was also pointing his finger at him, and he didn't have his fist or hand in a position of striking Mr. Coffey. He was pointing his finger like he was making a statement to him.
That's not required, is it, for him to ball up his fist or to act as if he's going to assault? That's not required for a level 3 response, is it?
No, sir.
Okay. And so you said earlier, I would never second guess an officer, but in fact, that's exactly what you're doing. That's exactly what you did whenever you made this determination, because you didn't have the advantage of audio. You had not watched the video showing Mr. Kyle's aggressive behavior towards Mr. Coffey prior to making your decision, right?
That's correct.
You didn't speak to any corrections officers prior to making this decision that were present that day, did you?
No, sir.
Okay. And from the video, he lunges at him, he points at him. Mr. Coffey then, in his perception, begins rough physical force, so pushes rough physical force under the use of force continuum, right?
Yes, sir.
On a level 3.
Yes, sir.
That policy says that pursuant to Hamblen County Sheriff's policy, department policy, Once inmates are perceived as actively resistant, officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. That's correct. Okay. And so he was under an obligation at that point in time when he perceived Mr. Kyle as being actively resistant. He began using rough physical force to shove him out of the slams or the bunk area into the hall. He was, until he could gain control of the situation and lead him to an isolated cell, he was within the bounds of this policy to continue using rough physical force, which would include an open-handed slap, correct?
He was within the bounds to use that, yes, but he did not choose to do so because once he got outside of the door, they stopped instead of continuing on to the cell block.
Well, even though he had his hands or had his belongings in his hands, he continued to visibly be excited, and it appears he was still being confrontational with Lieutenant Coffey, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so he continued with rough physical force, which includes shoving, open-handed slaps, until Mr. Kyle was placed into the drunk tank, which is an isolated cell pursuant to policy, correct?
Yes.
This policy 8.1 also says, under application of force on page 4, the last sentence, it says, facts unknown at the time force is used should not be considered later to determine whether force was justified. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. And that's exactly what happened here, wasn't it? We don't have the advantage of audio. You hadn't seen the video of what had happened prior to him going out into the hallway when you made the termination decision. But yet you made that termination decision and you considered, even though facts were unknown to you at the time, force was used, and it was later determined that it was unjustified. That's in direct violation of your own policy, isn't it, sir?
I made my determination on the second video that I seen today. The first video did not determine my determination on what I seen on the second video. When I see one of my officers strikes an inmate who is standing there, and we will never know what was being said, if anything was being said at the time of the striking, but I will not tolerate that type of abuse on an inmate who has serious medical problems to begin with.
But your own policy said that you should not consider facts unknown to you when making the termination decision, and admittedly, by your own testimony, that's exactly what you did.
I made my decision on watching the video.
Right. But you didn't know what had happened prior to going out into the hallway. So those were unknown facts to you, right?
That was unknown facts. I had nothing to do with my decision on the final video I seen.
Right. It couldn't possibly have because you didn't see it.
Would make a difference.
It was unknown to you. You didn't know what had happened. We've agreed, or at least Ms. Laws testified, that at that point in time, Mr. Kyle was being actively resistant. James Coffey had to use rough physical force. Pursuant to policy, he had to continue using rough physical force. And the only thing you saw was a small snippet of him stepping out into the hallway, not knowing the background. Was that video available to you?
It probably would have been if I had known about the video then.
Mr. Chairman, without an objection here, Mr. Gibbons is arguing that he's considering unknown facts when in fact he didn't consider unknown facts. And that's
I'm gonna object to the speaking objections if you have an objection.
Objection to the form of the question then.
He's testified he didn't see that first part of the video. He didn't consider making his decision, so let's move on.
Okay. And would you agree, pursuant to Sheriff's Policy 8.1 on page 5, that officers have no obligation to retreat or back down before resorting to approved use of force?
Yes.
Are you aware of other incidents occurring in the jail in which individuals have been struck while being restrained, in which there was no punishment issued?
No, sir.
Are you familiar with an incident that occurred with a Corporal Kitts in 2019 in which he struck a restrained inmate and there was no punishment issued?
We have had I think at least 2 other assaults that had been investigated by the district attorney's office.
Yes, sir. Was that one investigated by the
I
DA's
think
office?
it was, yes.
Do you know one for sure, or you just?
I know there was 2. One got convicted and was convicted of assault, and she was terminated. And the other one was investigated by the district attorney's office, and no charges were placed.
Okay. And do you know if that was specifically Mr.?
I think it was Pierce.
Do you know how long Mr. Coffey had served in the jail over the course of his career?
I do not. I know he has been an officer with the sheriff's department since I've been the sheriff.
You're not aware of any other incidents against him for excessive use of force, right?
Just rumors.
Okay. But you've never seen any of those or disciplined him for any excessive use of force, correct? Other than this incident?
That's correct.
Why did it take nearly a month for him to be terminated? This date of incident was 6/21. His termination notice was issued, I think, on 7/19. Why did it take so long?
I think it is because it had not technically been brought to my attention as to the seriousness of the videos that have been presented.
And who brought that to your attention?
Teresa Laws, Captain Laws, asked me if I had seen the video. I had not seen the video. At the sheriff's department, I do a lot of delegations.
Yes, sir.
Because I have intelligent, responsible people that can do the jobs. And I don't look over the shoulder, I don't micromanage. So when she asked me, I needed to look at the video, I did.
If he was considered to be a danger to the inmates, why was he not immediately placed on suspension?
What was that question?
If he was considered to be a danger to the inmates, as you've described, he's sucker punched. You didn't say he was a danger, but you said you don't allow inmates to be abused and that sort of thing. Why was he not immediately suspended upon you reviewing the video?
My action after I seen the video, I called Chief Miles up and I said, I want James Coffey terminated.
Okay.
For just cause.
And do you recall what date that was?
No, sir, I do not.
Do you know how long after the incident it was?
No, sir, I do not.
Do you know how long it was before he was actually terminated after you made that statement?
No, sir.
What is your understanding of the termination process for an employee that's no longer on probationary status with the sheriff's department?
In regards to what?
How does that to occur pursuant to the sheriff's civil service board?
On the termination?
Yes, sir.
We investigate the incident and then we will have the employee come in and Chief Miles will talk to them. And at that point in time, my command staff and I, if necessary, we will all be involved. And most of the time they will resign.
They'll resign.
Resign.
Was Mr. Coffey offered that?
I'm sure he will.
Are you familiar with the civil service rules for the Hamblen County Sheriff's Department?
I have read the book, yes.
Okay. Mr. President, or Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
Sheriff Johnny, I'm going to ask you to take a look at page 10. Mr. Captain, you need a copy of that, please. Okay.
You wouldn't have to have an extra copy?
I do, I
I've
have two
never seen
extra.
it. Is that an extra copy?
They both are extra, yes.
Oh.
They need to be in as well.
Thank you.
Are you on page 10, sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And looking at, and starting on page 9, actually, paragraph, I think my Roman numerals, 17, reprimand, suspension, dismissal, and hearings. Do you see that section on page 9 at the bottom?
Yes.
Okay. It appears that this is setting forth how reprimands, suspensions, and dismissal should be handled. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So it goes through with the disciplinary matter, and then it talks about that the sheriff may suspend any employee for causes stated for a period of not more than 10 days, and there should be no right of appeal. Is that right? Your understanding?
Yes.
And if an employee is suspended for more than 10 days within any given 6-month period, then they should be notified, or the board, each board member shall be notified in writing for the reasons and give the officer the right to answer charges. So that's for suspension. But then we go on down here to dismissal, and going over to page 11, it says, on paragraph, number 2, it says the employee shall be furnished a written notice containing the nature of the proposed action, the reasons therefor, and his rights to answer the charges in writing. A copy of the notice will also be sent to the board. The employee will be given the opportunity to concur either in person or in council and to introduce testimony in his or her behalf at a public hearing held by the board. Did I read that accurately?
Yes, sir.
So it appears from this procedure that the termination form that was issued is simply a proposed action at the time that it's issued. Would you agree with that by this?
Yes.
Okay. And did you provide a copy of Mr. Coffey's termination notice to the civil service members?
I did not.
Okay. And why not?
That is the duties of Chief Mines.
Okay. And do you know if Chief Mines provided that to the civil service members?
I did not. He's here to testify.
Okay. And ultimately, it is the board's decision whether or not to approve the proposed action by you as sheriff. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's for employees that are not probationary employees, correct?
Yes.
You have authority to dismiss at will for employees employed less than 6 months. Is that
Yes, sir.
accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. These be made the next exhibit.
So then, she can mark on.
Thank you. With Mr. Coffey's long tenure with the Sheriff's Department and there being no other incidents of excessive force, why was there not any other progressive discipline used rather than termination?
Because I felt like that was grounds for termination because of striking of this defenseless inmate.
And you made that termination decision prior to any indictment by the grand jury, correct?
That's correct.
In fact, that didn't come back until September the 13th, and your termination decision was issued on July 19th.
I don't know the date, but it did come back to appeal.
Okay, but approximately 2 months before Mr. Coffey was indicted, you went ahead and made that termination decision. I think I have any additional questions at this time.
Yeah, just a couple. Sheriff Jarnigan, let me direct your attention, and I believe it is policy number 8.1, which has been admitted probably as exhibit number 4 or 5. If it has not been, it needs to be. Or exhibit 4. I'm going to hand you this, my copy here, and let you look at that. I'll say I'm going to hand you that, my copy. That may be the last copy I have. I may have a copy of one. Let me just retrieve the exhibit itself and I'll read from you. Sheriff, let me ask you to go to, page 3 of page 9. And then to level 3, which there's been a lot of talk about what type of resistance there is and what type of force can be used and what was used in this circumstance. And let me direct your attention to the last sentence in that under level 3. It says, once inmates are perceived as actively resistant, officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. You see where that says that?
Yes, sir.
What does that mean? That you continue to use the same level of force that you began to use, or what does that sentence mean if you understand that?
It doesn't justify using the same level of force. It just justifies that you know that you have a situation on your hand. You should not become complacent and not stay in a high mode of alert.
And could it mean you should not lose contact with that inmate?
Yes.
And you should continue to.
Objection, Chairman, the document can speak for itself. I would object to the characterization of it.
I think both sides have asked witnesses their opinion on what this stuff means, so I'll allow it.
Could it mean you don't lose contact with the inmate?
That's correct, especially visual contact.
And that you see to that inmate's movement to a safe location?
Yes, as rapidly as you can.
That's all I have.
Any further questions?
Nothing further, Mr. Chairman. It'd be possible to take a brief.
That's what I was getting ready to say. We'll take a 10 minutes or so recess.
Let Kira run over there for the
That's the
deal.
hot, Chief Mines, there's a hot seat right there.
Run the deal.
Right here. Right here.
Do I correctly state your name to be Wayne Mize?
Yes.
And you're the Chief Deputy of the Hamblen County Sheriff's Department, is that
Yes,
right?
sir.
How long you been that Chief Deputy?
15 years.
Okay. Did you become aware of an incident in the jail back in June 21st or shortly thereafter?
I did.
And it involved Lieutenant Coffey here, who was a night jailer, supervisor.
Yes.
And when did you become aware of that?
During the summer. I'm not sure.
After you became aware of it, did you view a video either by yourself or with the sheriff of an incident that occurred down in the jail?
Yes, sir, I did.
Did you view that together with the sheriff or by yourself first? Or you remember?
I think the sheriff and I did.
As a result of viewing that video, did the sheriff advise you to take some action regarding Mr. Coffey's employment?
Yes.
And did you prepare a termination statement of Mr. Coffey's employment?
Yes.
We have marked an exhibit of that termination statement, Exhibit 2. Thank you, Mr. Reporter. If I could retrieve that and let you look at that exhibit. Here you go, Chief.
That's correct.
That's the termination form that you provided Mr. Coffey, correct?
Yes.
And it bears your signature and that of Captain Laws?
Yes.
And you've taken that action at the direction of the sheriff after viewing the video?
Right.
That was not your decision, but the sheriff's decision, is that right?
Exactly.
Do you make those types of decisions, or is that the sheriff's responsibility?
The sheriff's responsibility, anytime the termination is involved, it's his sole.
Were you personally the one that gave that termination statement to Mr. or Lieutenant Coffey?
Yes,
You hand-delivered that to him?
yes,
Did you have a meeting with him to give him that?
yes,
Did
in
you,
my office,
did you explain to him the reasons that he was being terminated?
yes,
And he wrote on the back of it, I do not agree, is that right?
yes,
So you knew at that point that he was going to appeal the decision? Did you provide a copy of that form to the Civil Service Board at any point?
yes.
And, other than that, do you have any additional information to add to this hearing today?
No,
But give us, man, some questions for you, Chief.
Chief Myers, who is responsible for investigating, the incident on June 21st?
Well,
Mr. Coffey, I'm sorry.
the video speaks for himself.
My question to you is, who was responsible for investigating the incident? Did you perform that, or did anyone else that you're aware of?
No, Teresa, Captain Laws.
Did you review the statement of Corrections Officer Chris Davis?
Yes,
And what do you recall about that statement?
he did not see anything.
Do you recall him saying that Mr. Kyle was cursing Mr. Coffey? He was calling him racist, and he was failing to follow commands.
He was just standing there.
Okay. My question to you, sir, is do you recall him saying, or either in his statement, or did you ever speak to him personally?
No,
Okay. Who is Teresa Laws the one that's responsible for investigating incidents that occur in the jail?
yes, in Marcy.
Okay, and who is Marcy?
The FTO.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Josh Marcy?
Yeah, FTO,
Okay. And do you know if he conducted an investigation in this matter?
yes.
And what did he do to conduct an investigation?
I really don't recall.
Okay. Did you ever review any results of any sort of investigation, or did you ever speak to Mr. Kyle directly?
No,
Did you ever speak to Mr. Coffey about his side of the story?
no,
Do you recall Mr. Coffey actually being the one that informed you of this incident?
do what now?
Do you actually recall that it was Mr. Coffey that informed you of this incident, or what do you recall being first notified?
It was brought up, to my office, copy of the, video.
Okay, and who brought that to you?
I think Marcy.
Okay. And did you have any discussions with Mr. Marcy?
No.
Have you received training in response to resistance policy of Hamblen County Jail?
Yes.
Okay. Where would an open hand slap fall on the use of force continuum utilized by the Hamblen County Sheriff's Department? Do you
It
know?
does not.
It does not?
It does not.
Okay. If Captain Laws testified that it would fall on level 3, do you think she's incorrect?
I don't know. The open hand slap, is never appropriate.
Okay. Where are you getting that information?
The, use of force the use of force, number 8.
It's 8.1 is the policy.
Yeah.
The levels, the actual continuum, use of force continuum itself, the diagram is on the very back page, but the officers' corresponding force options are listed on page 3 of policy 8.1. Is there somewhere in this policy that you're aware that an open-handed slap is never permitted as a use of force?
No.
So when you testified to that earlier, was that just your own perception, or is there something to back that up?
Level 3.
Okay. Well, Teresa Laws testified that using other forms of rough physical force would include an open-handed slap. Do you disagree with that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And how long has it been since you've received training on this use of force?
Well, probably over the 15 years that I have been there, we have rewritten the jail policies as well as the sheriff's department policy.
Okay. My question to you, sir, is when was the last time you received training on the use of force continuum?
I have no idea.
Okay. Several years ago?
Several years ago.
And so would you agree this policy is a more accurate reflection than your memory?
Exactly.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. And so if Ms. Laws testified that an open-handed slap would fall under other forms of rough physical force under level 3, you would have no reason to disagree with that based upon this document, would you?
Soft hands does not involve slapping. That is to get their attention.
Is this your own perception, or is this somewhere contained in the policy is what I'm asking?
No.
Where is it contained in the policy?
No, absolutely not. That's my opinion.
Okay. So that's not what the policy reflects, though, is it?
No.
Did you, in watching the video, Sheriff Jarnigan testified today that he had only seen the view that was out in the hallway, and he had not seen the view that showed the earlier interaction between Lieutenant Coffey and Mr. Kyle in the annex portion where the bunks were. Did you see that view?
Yes.
Okay. What do you recall about that view?
Probably Coffey threw him out the door.
Okay.
And that's all I recall.
Do you recall Mr. Kyle approaching Mr. Coffey in a quick, aggressive manner and pointing in his face?
Out in the hall?
No, sir. In the annex portion where the bunks were.
No.
Okay. You don't dispute that happened. You just don't know. You just don't recall it.
I have no idea.
Okay. Representing to you that did happen, would you agree that would be active resistance?
It could be, or it could not be.
Okay. If Mr. Coffey was giving him commands to exit the door and he approaches, under that scenario, would you agree it would be active resistance?
I wasn't there.
Okay. I understand that, but I'm asking you, based on your knowledge of being captain, and you said you had received training several years ago, Based on your understanding of the use of force continuum, would that qualify as active resistance?
No,
Okay. In your opinion, what qualifies as active resistance?
running away.
And again, is this your own perception, or is there anything contained in this policy that would reflect that?
I have no idea.
Is it safe to say you don't know this policy very well?
No,
It's
I
not.
have no idea. I have read it. I read it. It's a lengthy policy, and all level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. That's my position on it.
Okay. But my question to you is, would you agree that you're not extremely familiar with this policy?
No,
No, you're not, or no, you wouldn't agree?
no, I was not.
No, you're not familiar with the policy. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. But yet, part of the reason that Mr. Coffey was terminated was because he supposedly used excessive force, correct?
The video shows that.
Okay. My question to you is that part of the reason that Mr. Coffey was terminated, because the sheriff's department alleges he used excessive force?
Yes,
Okay. And did you ask, or did you discuss with Sheriff Jernigan whether or not his response based on company, or based on department policy, was adequate or inadequate? Did you have any sort of discussion with Sheriff Jernigan about that after seeing the video?
no, we are all watched the video, and it was a termination affair.
Well, Sheriff Jernigan testified he only watched part of the video out in the hall. He didn't see the earlier incident. And now Ms. Laws testified that she did see it, and she's testified here today that she would agree it was active resistance, and that an open-handed slap with rough physical force that would be warranted. Do you disagree with that?
No, the video I saw was out in the hall, and he slapped him.
Okay. Did you ever see the annex portion?
I saw it and didn't pay much attention to it.
Don't you think that was important to see how the incident began and what level Mr. Coffey was dealing with once they got out into the hall? Would that not be important?
No.
It's not important to you?
No. It was in the hall that he slapped him.
I understand that, sir. I'm just saying there were events that happened before that had escalated to a point, as we saw on video, but you didn't take that into consideration?
No.
Were you familiar with Richard Corey Call prior to this incident?
No.
Never met him before?
No.
Is Jimmy Brooks an investigator for internal affairs investigations within the sheriff's department? Or James Brooks, excuse me?
Jim Brooks?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay. Did he perform an investigation into these allegations, Mr. Cobb?
Yes.
Okay. And what was the result of his investigation?
Termination.
It's your testimony that Jim Brooks made a termination recommendation?
Yeah.
Do you know why Sheriff Jernigan would have testified that Jim Brooks did not perform the investigation, but instead that he referred it to the district attorney's office?
I am not sure. Jim Brooks frequently does that. I called Bob Ellis and at the DA's office and transferred everything to
My question to you is, do you know why Sheriff Jernigan would have testified Jim Brooks did not investigate it, and instead it was referred to the DA's office. Your testimony was that he did investigate it, and he made a termination recommendation, which is accurate.
No. Usually he does. I just assumed that he did.
Okay. So when you said he made a termination recommendation, that's not an accurate statement,
No,
is it?
no.
Why did you make that statement?
I would assume that Jim Brooks did it and he recommended.
Why did you assume that?
He usually does it. And that is why I assumed that.
But you didn't say in your testimony that you were assuming he had performed one. You said he did, then you followed up with that he had made a termination recommendation. Is that an untrue statement?
Yes.
Why did you make an untrue statement?
I have no idea.
Do you have an opinion about how James Coffey had performed his job as lieutenant prior to the incident on June 21st, 2021?
What time period?
Well, for the entire 20 years that he was there, so did you feel like he was a good employee?
He's had several write-ups, and I don't know what they were, but that is based on Captain Lawson.
Or was he a good employee or no, in your opinion?
I have no idea.
Your Captain Laws is his direct supervisor, and then you're over Captain Laws, and you don't have any idea if a man that's served in the sheriff's department for 20 years is a good employee or not?
I have no idea.
You don't know one way or the other for a man that served for 20 years. He thinks that. You don't have observation or opportunity to observe Mr. Coffey and his job performance.
Only when he comes upstairs.
You're never down in the jail or ever observe him in his area as lieutenant of the jail.
No.
You're not aware of any other excessive force disciplinary actions against James Coffey in his 20-year career with the sheriff's department, are you?
No.
I don't think I have any additional questions.
Nothing further for Chief Mine.
You may be excused.
Please rest and preserve the vote.
Dr. Kirk, yes.
We call Captain Chad Mullins, please. All right, no, actually, let me get Mr. Marshall.
Martin? Okay, all right, got you.
That's the last thing.
M-A-R-S-P-E.
Marcy or
Marcy.
Martin.
It's on the council.
I can read it. Please state your name for the record.
Josh Marcy.
Mr. Marcy, I'm Wendy Evans, I represent Mr. Coffey. We appreciate your help on the technical aspects here today. What is your job title?
Facility training officer.
Okay, and what do those duties entail?
Any new hire that is brought into the jail, they go through a week of paperwork training for the policy and procedure and rules and regulations and all that.
And you provide that training?
I do.
What was your role in either James Coffey's termination of employment or investigating the incident on June 21st, 2021?
I got a request from Corey Kyle on the computer stating the date and what happened. Pulled the video, took it straight to Cap, took it straight to, she told me to take it to Chief.
Okay. So that's the only thing that was done?
That's the only thing I,
Okay. And so there's a kiosk that inmates can do this inside the jail, I
Yes,
assume?
they send out requests and grievances and medical requests.
Okay. So you received a complaint from does this kiosk, if they do, does that come directly to you automatically?
Comes to our computer, we gotta log into a system and check it.
Okay. Were you aware of this incident prior to receiving this?
Was not.
Do you work days or nights?
I work days.
And Mr. Coffey works nights primarily, is that
Yes.
right? So you pulled the video, was that at Captain Law's request?
Yes.
Right. And did you and Captain Laws, meet with Mr. Kyle about his complaint?
I did not. Not until after she told me to take it to chief. They told me to get his statement.
Okay. So how long after the incident itself that occurred did you get his statement?
Probably a week, maybe.
Is that a written statement?
Yes.
Yeah.
Probably one that you didn't.
I see. Let me ask you if that's what you're referring to.
Yes, sir.
And what's the date on that?
6/21/21.
Okay. That's the date that this incident occurred. Is it your recollection that it was done a week later, or was it done shortly after the incident? Or
When I pulled the video,
when this statement was actually made?
I want to say it was probably a week later.
Did you actually watch him write that up?
I did.
Okay. So do you know why he would have dated it back to 6/21 instead of?
I told him to put the date that it had.
Okay. Did you assist him in any other way in filling out that report?
I did not.
And so at that point in time, if I understand correctly, you had pulled the video, you had given it to Chief Mize, and then Chief Mize told you to retrieve Mr. Kyle's statement, all right?
Yes.
Did you discuss the incident with Mr. Kyle at all?
I did not.
Was Ms. Laws present in this meeting with Mr. Kyle?
Don't think so. I don't remember 100%.
Basically, you just said, here's the form, write out your complaint, and I'll pass it along type thing?
Absolutely.
Did anyone ever take Mr. Coffey's statement that you're aware of?
I did not. Once it got out, once I turned it over to somebody higher than me, I was out.
Chief Mize never said, yeah, Mr. Kyle's statement, but you also need to get James Coffey's statement?
He did not.
Did he say you might need to get some of the other COs that were there that night, they might want to get their statements?
He told me that they need to come in and give their statement.
Okay. Do you know?
I did not get those.
Okay. Do you know if they in fact did those?
I'm assuming yes.
Okay. And who were those individuals?
Officer Davis, Officer Tate, and George Marshall.
Okay.
Our nurse.
Do you know if they gave any written statements?
Not to my recollection.
Okay. You don't know one way or the
I
other?
did not. I don't know either way.
Did you make any recommendation, or do you have any authority to make a recommendation whether or not Mr. Coffey should have been reprimanded or terminated?
Absolutely not.
Do you provide training on the use of force?
I do.
Did you watch? Well, obviously, I assume you watched the video. You provided it, and so whenever the first part of the video, when they were in is that the annex?
Yes,
portion?
sir.
Okay. And you saw Mr. Coffey had his hand with a clipboard, and he approaches Mr. Kyle on that video. At some point in time, it appears that Mr. Kyle makes a sudden aggressive move, pointing at Mr. Coffey, and Mr. Coffey is trying to give him commands. Would you agree with that characterization?
Yes, I would.
Okay. And at some point, Mr. Coffey when he's asking to go outside, he ends up having to force him outside, correct?
Yes.
Would you agree, based on the use of force continuum, that Mr. Kyle was being actively resistant at that point in time?
At that point in time, yes.
Okay. And would you agree that rough physical force, including shoving, Even open hand slaps would be permitted under level 3?
At that point, yes.
Okay. And so he was within the sheriff's department policy as you teach it, correct? Whenever he took those actions. Is that a yes?
Yes, sir.
And then the policy says, we've looked at it a few times, policy 8.1, are you familiar with that policy?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I have another copy of it here. This isn't the official one, we've got an exhibit mark, but I'm gonna let you look them down. Make sure I read correctly. On the third page, when it says level 3, which we're in agreement, he was being actively resistant.
Yes.
Based upon video.
Inside the annex.
Yes, sir. And then rough physical force was used to shove him out. Say yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. An open-handed slap would be included in rough physical force.
Yes.
Okay. The policy says once inmates are perceived as actively resistant, officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. I read that correctly?
Yes, sir.
And on the application of force paragraph on page 4. It says facts unknown at the time force is used should not be considered later to determine whether the force was justified. What do you understand that paragraph or that sentence to mean?
What was it?
Yes, sir. In that last sentence, it says facts unknown at the time force is used should not be considered later to determine whether the force was justified. What do you understand that sentence to mean?
That what happened before shouldn't be justified for what was happening at that time.
Let me ask you what I understand to mean, and just so clear.
That's fine.
It appears to me that it's saying if facts are unknown, you shouldn't second guess what force was used as justified if you don't know the facts of the situation.
Facts unknown to just trying to make sure.
To any decision maker, I assume. Would that be referring to that? Yes. I want you to also look at page 5, the second paragraph. It says officers have no obligation to retreat or back down before resorting to approved use of force, including deadly force. Did I read that accurately?
You did, sir.
Did Mr. Coffey have any obligation pursuant to this policy, as you understand and teach it, to retreat once he had began rough physical force against Mr. Kyle in order to get him to an isolated cell?
The way I teach it is, let's say I come up, smack you in your face, lay down. At that point, I am compliant.
Okay.
So that means you can go from compliant to extreme, then back down.
Okay. And in this video, whenever they were out in the hall, you saw the smack. Mr. Kyle, he certainly didn't lay down. In fact, he dropped his things and at one point in time appeared as if he was going to square up with Mr. Coffey. Would you agree with that assessment?
I would agree.
Okay. So would you agree that he continued to be non-compliant?
Once he threw his stuff back down, absolutely.
And this all happened pretty quickly once he was outside the door, correct?
Yeah, it's within, I think the whole video lasts probably 6 minutes.
Right. And officers, this use of force continuum, it's based upon a reasonable officer's perception, right?
Yes.
And their response is based on a reasonable officer's response.
Absolutely.
And based on that use of force continuum, do you think Mr. Coffey reasonably perceived the situation as being actively resistant? Mr. Cobb?
At the time of the incident inside, yes.
Okay.
When Mr. Kyle had his hands full, that's the part in question.
But if he's still yelling and cursing and being excited, and even though he's got his hands full, that doesn't change the fact that he's still being non-compliant in the face of being commanded to do other things, correct?
Yes, but at that point, he's not physically.
Even though he's within close proximity?
Yes.
Do you say that as you review back? But, I mean, in the moment, that's how we have to look at it, right?
Right.
And with it happening so quickly, can you see where it was reasonably perceived by Mr. Coffey as being actively resistant?
Yes, at that time.
And if that was his perception, he was justified in using rough physical force, including shoves and even an open-handed slap, correct? That was his reasonable perception.
That was his reasonable perception.
And he would have been within company policy, the sheriff's policy as it's written and contained in 8.1 here.
Yes, sir.
Do you know if James or Jim Brooks ever investigated this matter?
I want to say Jim Brooks watched the video when the chief did, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Do you know if he made any recommendation one way or the other as to what should occur? Are you aware of any other instances in which other COs have struck a restrained inmate and not been punished?
I'm aware of 2 separate incidents that was sent to the DA's office that got either inmate did not comply to the DA, and the other one was dismissed, I'm pretty sure. There was no findings.
You testified just a moment ago that you could see where Mr. Coffey's perception was that he was actively resistant, and if that was his perception, he was justified in using level 3 force, correct?
Yes.
Based on that testimony, do you feel that Mr. Coffey's termination was warranted?
Yes and no.
Okay. Can you explain it to me?
The only part that's holding me back is his hands being full.
But as you've already said, pursuant to the policy,
I agree.
you could see where that was his perception.
Yes,
We're not-
it's different for each officer.
Right, and we don't have the advantage, or he didn't have the advantage of hindsight. We did now have that, but at the time when this was occurring, he had to act on his training and instruction. And would you agree he's qualified for the position?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that he is knowledgeable of the use of force continuum?
Yes.
And based on that fact, he acted in what he determined to be a reasonable manner. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
I may take a minute just. I don't have any additional questions this time.
Okay. Mr. Marcy, you are the trainer there and of using the force, use of force continuum, as you indicated. And you have indicated that Mr. Coffey's perception of, that his perception of resistance was his perception at the time.
Yes.
And that you as a trainer, basically, I'm getting the impression that it's not your position that you can second guess that.
Absolutely not.
But it is simple, is it not, to look at a video and see where an inmate is holding items in his hand and he is struck by an officer.
Yes.
And that's what you say is holding you back from saying, you know,
Being on one side or the other. Absolutely.
so you're not taking one side or the other.
No.
It was pointed out in 8.1, which I know you're familiar with, since you're the training officer. We pointed out and another witness at the end of level 3, the paragraph. Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
It says, once inmates are perceived as actively resistant, officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. Correct?
Yes, that's how it is.
And in response to Mr. Gibbons' question earlier, I think you indicated that there was resistance in the annex.
Yes.
You made a distinction,
Yes.
if I'm remembering that correct. You made a distinction between what happened in the annex and what happened in the hallway.
Yes.
And because he was non-compliant in the annex, he basically got shoved out into the hallway.
Yes.
Did that resistance not change at that point?
Yes, at that point.
Was he not compliant at that point? Yes. Things in his hand?
With the things in his hand, yes, he was compliant.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Just briefly, Mr. Marcy, and just so I'm clear, whenever I said to you earlier, he drops his thing, he becomes aggressive, and at one point even appears as if he's going to square up and maybe fight Mr. Coffey. Is he actively resistant at that point?
At that point, yes.
Okay. And so the fact that it can change in just a split second, an officer has to use his training as he's been taught policy, and his perception has to be reasonable. He doesn't have to be perfect in his response, but he has to be reasonable. And would you agree with that short time period and the way that Mr. Kyle was back and forth, that response could be deemed reasonable under the training that's been provided to Mr. Coffey and as you teach it?
Yes.
I would ask that Mr. Kyle's statement be entered as an exhibit. I don't think.
No objection.
You did enter that. I don't have anything else.
You may be excused.
Call Captain Chad Knowles. Captain Knowles, you state your name correctly, please.
Chad Mullins,
And what is your current position with the Sheriff's Department?
Operations Captain,
And how long have you held that position?
August 1st, 2019.
What are your primary duties in that role?
Over the law enforcement activities upstairs, patrol, narcotics, detectives.
Okay. Do you have any authority or duties as it relates to the jail itself?
They have their own command staff down there. I help only when I'm asked to.
Okay. And my understanding is Captain Laws is the head person for the jail, and then she reports to Chief Miser. Does she report to you?
Chief Miles.
Okay. So you had no direct authority over her either?
No, sir.
Do you know, how did you first come to learn of James Coffey's termination of his work?
The first time I heard about anything was Officer Marcy. I was in the detective's office when Officer Marcy brought up the video.
Okay. And did you view the video at that time?
I did.
Okay. Who else was present?
The detectives,
Okay. Do you recall which ones?
I believe Detective Mullins, Detective Brooks. There may have been another one or two in there, but I'm not sure.
Okay. It's my understanding that Detective Brooks sometimes serves as the internal affairs investigator for things that occur within the Sheriff's Department. Is that accurate?
It is.
Okay. And did he serve in that role for Mr. James Coffey?
He viewed the video and gave the video to Chief Miles.
Okay. Do you know, did he ever make a recommendation that Mr. Coffey should not be disciplined or turned over to the DA's office?
Not to my knowledge, no.
You don't know one way or the other. Did he make any recommendations to Captain Mines that you're aware of after watching the video?
No.
Is it unusual for this type of incident to be turned directly over to the DA's office rather than being investigated in-house?
I'm not a part of it. There's been some that has been turned over to the DA's office most of the time. If it's one of our own, that's what happens.
Okay. Did you conduct any sort of investigation into the allegations against Mr. Coffey? Have you ever served as a jailer or corrections officer?
In 1996.
Okay, it's been a while then, huh?
Been a minute.
Are you trained, I assume, still in the response to resistance policy of Hamblen County Sheriff's Department?
Yes, we have different policies for patrol than what there is in jail. They're mostly similar, but there's some difference.
Okay, and who provides that training to you all in patrol and in your role?
When we go to in-service training or 40-hour training.
Okay, and does Officer Marcy, does he provide that training to you all as well?
No.
Okay.
He only does the corrections.
Okay. Did you make any sort of recommendation as to what should occur to Mr. Coffey?
I did not make a recommendation. The sheriff and the chief, and I watched the video as well. The sheriff made a recommendation to terminate him, and Chief Miles wrote the termination letter.
Okay. And now Sheriff Jarnigan has testified that he only saw one view of the video from when they were actually out in the hallway there. And he had not viewed the annex portion of the video prior to making that termination decision.
I've not seen the annex part.
Okay. Do you think that would be important if there was events that occurred in there to determine whether or not Mr. Coffey's response to the situation was reasonable?
I'd say it has something to do with it, but that's not what happened outside.
Okay. But were you aware that Mr. Kyle had refused to comply with Mr. Coffey's commands inside the annex? He made a quick, aggressive move, including pointing in his face, and then Lieutenant Coffey then used rough physical force, which is my understanding that's a level 3 response. Are you familiar with that?
Not really.
Okay. Are you familiar with whether or not what I just described to you by Mr. Kyle would be a level 3 actively resistant or not?
I've not seen the video. If it's just verbally, I don't know. I guess that's where we use what they say, soft hands.
Okay. What does soft hands include?
To gain control of somebody, hold somebody, move somebody.
Okay. Like grab by the arm or something of that nature?
I think once you step up to the next level, that's when you can get into strikes, you can get into pepper spray, things of that nature.
I went through it with Captain Walls, and it states that you can, if the officer's perception is that the reasonable perception, not just arbitrary, but if his reasonable perception is that the individual is being actively resistant, then as part of level 3 in his response, you're justified in using those that you described, as well as rough physical force.
You could go up or come down as well.
Okay. But rough physical force is a level 3 response. Are you aware of that?
I'm not. I don't have that.
Okay. Would you agree that an open-handed slap could be included as rough physical force?
Yes.
And then a hard fist would be the next level up if you strike somebody with a clenched fist, correct?
Yes.
You're not aware of Mr. Coffey doing that, are you? The clenched fist.
I couldn't tell really with the video if it's an open hand or a fist.
Were you aware at some point in time, though, that even Mr. Kyle said he was slapped rather than punched?
I have never spoken to Mr. Coffey.
Okay. Do you recall a meeting with Mr. Bob Ellis in which you called Mr. Coffey into the office?
Yes, I worked that day and we were short-handed on patrol, so I was having to cover patrol. And Mr. Ellis asked me if I would call Bob or call Lieutenant Coffey so he could talk to him and maybe be a witness to it.
Okay. And so you were just there in a witness capacity?
Yes.
What do you recall about that meeting? Did you make any statements?
The only thing that I recall from that is Bob Ellis said he interviewed Mr. Kyle, and Mr. Kyle at this time did not want to pursue any charges or anything against Lieutenant Coffey.
Okay. And Did you make any statements?
Not that I recall.
Okay. So was it your impression that Mr. Coffey was not going to be terminated at that point in time, or what? I assume Mr. Sheriff Jarnigan had already reviewed the video at that point in time. Is that accurate?
Objection. What are you saying?
Well, let me rephrase. Had Sheriff Jarnigan reviewed the video in the meeting that you had described earlier?
Before, I
Yes.
don't know, that was within a day or two.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, Sheriff Jarnigan testified that once he saw the video, he said he wanted a termination decision made, and he referred it to the DA's office. Do you know how that transpired?
Chief Mize gave the video to the DA's office.
And so I assume Bob Ellis would not have been involved
Correct.
until Chief Mize requested assistance from the DA, correct?
Correct.
So just from the logical flow of things, would you agree with that?
I would.
Okay. And so, at that point in time, did you have any understanding as to what action was going to be taken against Mr. Coffey from a disciplinary standpoint?
He was already terminated, I'm pretty sure, and the investigation on the assault was turned over to the district attorney's office.
Okay. Why was he at the jail, or why did Bob Ellis want to meet with him if he had already been terminated?
Can't remember if James was working that day or not. He was working that day.
Oh, you indicated. I'm just going on your own recollection here.
I mean,
So, it's your recollection that he had already been terminated? when
I
that
can't
occurred?
remember the series of events of, the only time that I was involved with James and Bob is when Bob told him that he spoke with Corey didn't want to pursue anything.
Do you remember, were you the one that called down for James to come upstairs?
I think it was.
Okay. So would that refresh your recollection
Yeah.
that he was still employed?
He was.
Okay, so he had not been terminated at that point in time?
Correct.
So, when Sheriff Jarnigan testified that he made a termination recommendation upon seeing the video, and then turned it over to the DA's office, does that seem to conflict with what you recall?
No.
So would he have made a termination decision, then turned it over to the DA's office and fired Mr. Coffey a month later?
I don't believe it was no month later.
Well, the incident I can represent to you happened on June 21st, 2021. The termination occurred on July 19th, 2021. So
I
right
don't
there.
believe Marcy got the complaint for 2 weeks.
Well, he testified that he received it approximately a week after the incident, so that would have been 6/28. And then, but it's dated 6/21, so that's 6/28. And then there's another 3 weeks or so that passed before Mr. Coffey is actually terminated. Do you know why that would have been?
I don't know when the date was that it was turned over to the DA's office.
But we know it was turned over before you and Mr. Ellis met with James Coffey, correct? Otherwise, Bob Ellis would have been there.
He wouldn't have been involved.
Right. So when Sheriff Jarnigan said he had made the termination recommendation after seeing the video, that doesn't appear to be a correct recollection. Would you agree with that?
Say that again.
When Sheriff Jarnigan testified that he made a termination recommendation immediately and that it be turned over to the DA's office, that would not appear to be a correct recollection based upon the testimony you provided.
Now, I don't know when Sheriff Jargon actually looked at the video.
Okay.
When he was terminated, I was asked to take James home to gather his stuff.
Okay. Were you present for the meeting, termination meeting?
We had spoke, but I think we watched the video sometimes at different times.
Did you have any recommendation ever about what should occur based on the video that you reviewed?
I never was asked, really.
Did you ever have a conversation with Mr. Coffey concerning where or who he was going to vote for sheriff?
Yes.
Okay. Tell me about that conversation.
James Coffey called me when we were off under the Louis ball games about another inmate, or not an inmate, but another officer with some type of sticker on his vehicle. And then in conversation that I was told some things, and I asked James about it, and he denied it and confirmed some other things.
Okay. What do you recall as best you can how that conversation went?
That I was told that he was supporting Todd, and he said
Todd Davidson?
Todd Davidson, and that he was offered a position by Todd Davidson to be chief jailer.
Who were you told that by?
Just, I don't know.
Okay, so you
So I
confronted,
just asked him on the phone
and what was his response?
that he was not with Todd Davidson, but he has been offered a position.
Okay. Do you think that an appropriate conversation to have with a subordinate?
I didn't see no problem with it. James and I have been friends for probably 28, 29 years.
And how long in relation prior to his termination of employment did that conversation occur?
Months, a couple months.
That's your recollection, it was a couple months?
Yeah, it was whenever the Little League All-Star team was playing. I was involved in it.
Do you have any other knowledge of the incident that you've not testified about here today? Just 1 second, Chairman. I don't have any additional questions for this time.
I have no questions this week. Maybe excuse me, thank you.
And I don't know, Chris, I'm fine with releasing these witnesses. It's whatever.
Can't, is that okay?
I'll just be
across the hall, I've got the recording.
Okay.
What do the attorneys want to do about one? Want to break, want to go through, it doesn't matter to me. I don't know how many.
I've got, Mr. Davis, Mr. Tate, and Mr. Marshall, it's whatever the board's preference is.
How long you would that be short with?
I'd say, Mr. Davis, maybe, if we want to take maybe a 45-minute break, I expect that we'll be able to finish up in an hour and a half, 2 hours.
It's gonna take an hour and a half to do that, so we'll break.
Maybe not, but I'm just talking underestimating. And then I'll have Mr. Carter.
Okay. So then let's break for lunch. Let's just say we'll be back here at 1:15.
Okay.
All right.
Oh, because obviously, I understand it. If this case goes up, the trial court reviews it on the record.
That's it. But I haven't viewed it.
I'm not-
We don't know that. We don't know if it's.
Okay, I'll try to check it out. Maybe during lunch.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Mr. Marshall, my name's Lynn Gibbons, I represent James Coffey. We're going, my understanding you have to work, so we're going to go ahead and get you, and we appreciate you being here. What is your full name?
George Anthony Marshall.
And what is your job duties with Hamblen County Sheriff's Department?
I work as a nurse down at the jail.
Okay. And are you an employee of the Sheriff's Department?
No, it's contracted out with Southern Headquarters.
Okay. And did you ever learn about an incident involving James Coffey and Mr. Richard Corey Coffey, excuse me? What do you recall about that incident?
They took him to the holding cell after the incident, and then he requested to see medical. He was brought to medical, and he was complaining about his side hurting. He said he had a little bit of a limp, but I watched him walk all the way to the holding cell and back out to the nurse station with a steady gait. And I got to the nurse station, he complained about his ear. I looked at him with an otoscope, no bleeding or anything. And then he complained about a busted lip, but it was also already clotted, and it was an old injury. But he also stated while he was in the nurse station that he got hit by another inmate the day before. So.
Okay. And did you check him after that incident with the other inmate?
I was not there, so.
Okay. So there was no visible trauma to Mr. Kyle, at least from this incident?
No, and then where he complained about his back, we ordered x-rays and they were all completely normal also. So.
Okay. So you're not aware of any injuries that were sustained by Mr. Kyle? Were you familiar with Mr. Kyle prior to June 21st?
Yeah, taking care of him at the jail.
Okay. He frequently has complaints and issues.
Yeah.
Does he frequently feign injury or complain that he's injured when he's actually not? Sure.
I mean, as far as whenever I've examined him, if there's been something wrong, I mean, I do something about it, but it's not my place to say if he's faking or not.
I understand. At least in this injury, from your examination of him, did not appear to be anything.
No.
Do you have any other knowledge regarding Mr. Coffey's termination of employment? I don't have any additional questions. Appreciate it.
No questions this week.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
We're now recessed till 1:15.
My name's Kevin Tate,
And what is your job title?
correctional officer,
How long have you served there?
11 months.
And do you recall an incident involving Mr. Richard Corey Kyle, as well as Lieutenant James Coffey, occurring approximately June 21st, 2021?
Yes.
What do you recall about the incident?
That night we were supposed to go in and rearrange some people to move. And myself, and Tom Brett Johnson, and Christopher Davis walks into the dorm with Lieutenant Coffey, and Chris Davis tells Corey Kyle to pack his stuff up and move down to the other end.
And kind of interrupt for a second. You're welcome to take your mask off if you'd like, but if you prefer to leave it on, you can. It's whatever you prefer. The chairman has allowed that.
Okay. Then Corey Kyle got agitated and proceeds to get up and then goes over to Coffey and then just starts talking crazy.
Okay. There's been some testimony that he was cursing Mr. Coffey, making allegations that he was racist. Have you ever observed Mr. Coffey act in any sort of racist manner at all? Okay. It appears from the video that Mr. Kyle, at one point in time, he was over from. Have you seen the video? You have? Okay. Have you seen the view from the annex? Whenever you all were actually all present in the annex? Okay. If you recall seeing that, it goes into the corner and you kind of don't see Mr. Kyle for a little bit, and then you see him rush back into the screen where he comes up to Mr. Coffey in a quick address minute. What was your impression as far as his compliance level at that point in time?
He wasn't very compliant. He was, it took a little bit to get him to grab his stuff, but then when he was getting his stuff, he threw his stuff back down and then ran back towards Coffey.
Okay.
In the middle.
Have you been trained on the use of force continuum?
Yes.
Okay. Would you classify, from your observation, Mr. Kyle that day, Mr. Kyle's conduct at the time he mentioned in the annex as being passively resistant or actively resistant?
Actively resistant.
Okay, and why do you say that?
At the time he was refusing to move.
Okay, and from your understanding, when an individual, I assume you received training on use of force continuum?
Yes.
Okay, who did you receive that training from? Okay. From your understanding of the use of force continuum, if an individual is being actively resistant, is an officer allowed to use rough physical force to respond to that active resistance?
That's all technique.
Okay. What do you mean by soft hand technique?
Open hands.
Okay. And would that include an open hand slap?
It could.
Okay. And that's the way that you've been taught? Okay. Could it also include shoving?
Yes.
All right. And did Mr. Coffey respond with open hands as you described it?
Yes.
Okay. And it appears from the video that he, at some point, was he instructing him to get outside, or what do you recall about what Mr. Coffey was saying to him?
He told him multiple times to get stuff in there.
Okay. And did he continue to curse and make allegations, Mr. Coffey?
Yes.
At any point in time, did he appear that he was complying or intended to comply?
No.
Okay. And then at some point, Mr. Coffey does in fact shove him out the door of the annex, right? Say yes? Yes. Okay. And from that point on the video, it appears that the only two officers that were present was Mr. Davis and Mr. Coffey.
Yes.
Okay. Did you have any other interaction with Mr. Kyle on June 21st, 2021, that evening?
Not that I can recall.
Okay. It's my understanding from the use of force continuum and reading that policy, Let's see the exhibit for the policy, 8.1. In looking at the policy and procedures 8.1 for the Hamblen County Sheriff's Department, level 3, Commissioner Approach.
Yes.
Level 3 says the inmate is perceived by the officer to be actively resistant. The appropriate response is compliance techniques. It goes on to say that some of those may include all reasonable means to bring the inmate into compliance as soon as possible. Chemical weapons, use of restraints, force movement, forcing an inmate's limbs behind the back, forcing an inmate down on the floor, against the wall, or using forms of rough physical force. Is it your testimony that that is the level that Mr. Kyle was at as far as resistance level?
Yes.
Okay. And the rough physical force from your training, would that allow a response from an officer to do an overhand slap or the pushing? It also says on the last sentence, once inmates are perceived as actively resistant, officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. What is your understanding of what that means? Once you engage in rough physical force, what does that sentence mean to you?
The situation's not de-escalated till he's put up.
Okay. And is it your understanding that even though whenever they went out in the hall, did Mr. Kyle continue to actively resist?
Objection.
To the extent you know after reviewing the video?
There was I still heard some cussings.
Sorry?
There was cussings.
Okay. And after reviewing that video, did it appear to you that Mr. Kyle continued to resist commands by Mr. Coffey?
So the video?
Yes, sir.
It's hard to tell what's in the video.
Okay.
Just watch that.
Could you hear Mr. Coffey continuing to give commands, or is that?
See, at that point, I couldn't hear anything because I was sitting there with two other inmates.
I understand. Was it, or is it your understanding at some point that Mr. Coffey did continue applying a response until Mr. Kyle was isolated in the drunk tank?
Yes.
And that from your understanding of the use of force continuum, was that an appropriate response by Mr. Coffey?
Yeah.
Based upon your observation of the situation, did you think that Mr. Coffey's employment should have been terminated?
Objection to the question. It's not his.
I'll say that he was qualified.
I understand. Thank you for your time, Mr. Tate.
Hold on, Mr. Day, I got a couple for you. I know you don't want to be there any more than we want to be here, but we're here. Let me ask you a couple questions here. In your training as a CO, you've been there 11 months, right? And you're trained on Mr. Marcy? And you indicated to Mr. Gibbons that open hand strike was part of level 3. But that's not in there or described as being part of it. Is that correct? Now, when COs are having a problem with an inmate, and would you have said, and I think you said that you could describe that as having a problem, what occurred between Mr. Kyle and Lieutenant Coffey? Would that be fair? There was a problem. There was a problem there. Is there any training that you've received that says if a CO is having a verbal altercation, if someone's being non-compliant, either passively or aggressively, that another CO step in to de-escalate the situation? That didn't happen here, did it?
No.
Are you not properly, you're properly trained to have, and have authority to have stepped in and have de-escalated that situation that was between Mr. Coffey and Mr. Kyle, are you not?
Yes.
You could have done that. Mr. Davis could have done that.
You need to answer, you still.
Yes, yes or no. Do you know any reason why, when the racist profanity that was being hurled, as we've heard, at Mr. Coffey, know any reason why he might not have just said, hey, take care of him? Would that not have been, do you know any reason first why that didn't happen?
Well, when you're sitting in there with a big group of people, like inmates, and they start to rush or move towards another inmate together, that's a sign of aggression towards the inmates as well.
Right.
And any wrong movement in there can cause an uproar.
So you were there.
Yes.
And Mr. Tate was there, or Mr. Davis was there, you are Mr. Tate.
Yes.
Amen. But Mr. Davis was there, and he accompanied, basically,
Yes.
Mr. Lieutenant Coffey and Mr. Kyle out the door. Mr. Kyle came out the door first in a kind of a headlong way, if you saw the video, and then Mr. Davis was following right behind. So there was at least one other officer who could have de-escalated, quote unquote, the situation that was going on between Mr. Coffey and Mr. Kyle, correct?
Yes.
Did Mr. Coffey say to you and Mr. Davis, hey, I'll take care of this, or anything of that nature?
No.
Did he ever say did you hear him ever say to Mr. Davis, take care of Mr. Kyle?
No.
When you saw the video, when Lieutenant Coffey struck Mr. Kyle, what did he do? What did Mr. Kyle do?
If I can recall, I think he dropped his stuff in and he's even more aggressive. But I've not seen the video.
He dropped his stuff, didn't he? He dropped his stuff and he assumed a more aggressive posture, right?
Yes.
So, as opposed to what Lieutenant Coffey says in his statement that he was de-escalating the situation, it didn't de-escalate it, did it? It escalated it.
I wasn't out there.
You saw the video.
I didn't see the video, yes.
But you were in the annex the whole time, but you did see the video. He's asked you about level 3, looking at, I believe it's, I don't know what exhibit it is.
It's 4 and I kept it up.
Exhibit 4, you can keep, I'll probably find another one over here, we got some many. He asked you about that, and in particular, he asked you about the last sentence. Maybe I'll find one of mine here. Got that over there. Make a paper airplane. Make a paper airplane. Thank you, sir. He asked you about level 3. It says, once inmates are perceived as actively resistant, officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. Remember him asking you about that?
Yes.
Does that mean that as a CO, you have to continue to use some type of physical force continually until somebody gets put in a cell?
No.
That's all I have. Thank you.
I have just
Anything else?
Just come forward.
Okay.
Mr. Tate, Mr. Capps asked you a couple questions about being able, another CO, to step in and de-escalate the situation. Mr. Coffey, it was he was your supervisor, correct?
Yes.
And he was the one that was coming in to do these rearrangements of the sleeping situation, is that right?
Yes.
So as a subordinate to Mr. Coffey, have you been trained that you should intervene with him and another inmate? Have you ever been provided any of that training?
No.
You're not aware of that in 8.1, the policy that we looked at earlier, are you? Mr. Capps stated that the situation was not de-escalated, that in fact it was escalated, but the purpose of removing Mr. Kyle from the annex was to de-escalate the situation in the annex so other inmates did not, I think you used the word uproar, became in an uproar, is that right? And was that the purpose in your training and in your observation that day of Mr. Kyle being removed from the annex? And then in fact, it doesn't appear from the video, at least what we see, that there was any uproar that occurred as a result of them removing him, right? Did it improve the situation? Yes. So Mr. Coffey's actions did de-escalate the situation as it was in the annex at the time that you were in there? Yes. All I have.
Anything else? Nothing further this week. Thank you.
And he can be released too, from my standpoint.
Yeah.
Let me just ask him to stay.
Okay. So just stay out there.
Do you care to send Mr. Davis in, please?
Yeah, I'll send him.
Thank you. Mr. Davis, you'll have a seat for us out there. Sorry to keep you waiting so long. Will you please state your name for the record?
Chris Davis.
And what is your title with the Hamblen County Sheriff's Department?
Correction officer.
How long have you served in that role?
11 months.
Okay. Do you recall an incident occurring between Richard Corey Kyle and Lieutenant Coffey on June 21st, 2021?
Yes, sir.
It appears, we've seen the video. Have you seen the video?
Yes, sir.
Okay. It appears in the video that you were present in the annex with Mr. Coffey, along with some other COs at the time, and then you assisted Mr. Coffey when Mr. Kyle was removed from the annex into the hallway. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In reviewing the video in the annex, it appears that Mr. Kyle became pretty agitated. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
From your observation, what type of behavior was Mr. Kyle engaging in?
He has been verbally aggressive towards Mr. Coffey.
Okay.
And just being loud, annoying, really.
Was he cursing?
Yes, sir.
Was he making allegations of racism?
Yes, sir.
Was there any racist remarks made by Mr. Coffey? Have you ever heard him make any sort of remarks?
No, sir.
Do you think Mr. Coffey was good at his job?
Yes, sir.
On the day that Mr. Kyle, that this occurred, at one point in time, it appears that Mr. Kyle kind of rushes over to Mr. Coffey and starts yelling and pointing his finger in his face. Do you recall that happening?
Yes, sir.
Have you been trained in the use of force continuum for the Sheriff's Department?
And when I first got hired in, yes, sir.
Okay. Would you classify his conduct that day as being passively resistant or actively resistant? And why is that?
Just the way he come at Mr. Coffey when Mr. Coffey wasn't even talking to him or anything like that. I was the one that had direct contact with him and told him to get in the spot where he's going to the slam.
Okay.
Mr. Coffey's worried about something else, and then he goes over and drops his stuff and just starts on him for no reason.
Okay. And was Mr. Coffey, was Mr. Kyle refusing to obey your commands? You told him to get his stuff and to move?
In a way he was, in a way he wasn't. He was hesitant. Like he was getting his stuff, but still being verbally aggressive, cussing, ranting and raving. And then as you see in the video, he throws his stuff down. And heads towards Mr. Coffey.
And at that point in time, did you consider him to be actively resistant?
Yes, sir.
And did he continue to refuse to follow Mr. Coffey's orders?
Yes, sir.
And based on your training on the use of force continuum, if an individual is actively resistant, are you allowed as an officer, or was Mr. Coffey allowed as an officer to use rough physical force to bring him into compliance?
Like I said, it depends on the situation.
Okay. And all I'm referring to is that is exhibit 4. Give that back, Chris. Excuse me. This is, do you recognize this as the Sheriff's Department policies and procedures?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I asked you the level of resistance, whether it was passively resistant, which is a level 2, or was it a level 3 actively resistant? And it was your testimony that he was actively resistant. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And this policy says that whenever they become actively resistant, compliance techniques may include all reasonable means to bring the inmate into compliance as soon as reasonably possible. And one of those listed as other forms of rough physical force. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And do you know that to mean that can mean shoving?
No, sir.
Okay. What does rough physical force mean that you recall from your training?
It's been a while. I ain't gonna lie to you.
I understand. Not going to quiz you on it or anything, but so once Mr. Coffey gets Mr. Kyle into the hallway, well, let me back up. When Mr. Kyle was still in the annex and was cussing and continuing to refuse to follow commands, did Mr. Coffey de-escalate the situation by removing him outside so as not to upset other inmates?
Yes, sir.
And was that your understanding as to why Mr. Kyle wanted him out of the annex and into the hallway?
Mr. Coffey wanted him out?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then in the video, it appears that Mr. Coffey had slapped Mr. Kyle at some point in time. Were you aware of that?
No, sir.
Okay. After reviewing the video, were you aware of it?
Yeah, I know what.
Okay. But you were just now coming out right after that had happened.
Yes, sir. I was still stuck in between the door and looking back into the office.
Okay. And so this level 3 also says that once inmates are perceived as actively resistant, officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. From your training and in the practice that you've been instructed in, what does that sentence mean? Once you engage in physical force with an inmate and they are perceived as being actively resistant, what are you supposed to do at that point?
Restrain them until they're under control.
And then are you supposed to put them in an isolated cell?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And is that what occurred in this situation?
Yes, sir.
From your observation of the video and in your direct observation from being there, do you feel like Mr. Coffey complied with the use of force continuum as you've been trained?
Yes, sir.
This document also states that on page 5, officers have no obligation to retreat or back down before resorting to approved use of force, including deadly force. Obviously, we're not talking about deadly force here, but is it your understanding that you can stand your ground and you can take control of the situation based upon this statement in the policy?
Yes, sir.
Were you ever questioned by anyone about the incident? Did either Chief Mize or Captain Laws or Officer Marcy, did anybody ever come, or Sheriff Jarnigan, did any of them ever come to you and ask you about your observations of what happened that day?
No, sir.
So whenever you wrote the statement out on what had happened, or at least what you observed, that statement was dated July 15th, 2021.
Yes, I was asked by, Mr. Coffey to write a statement.
Okay. And is this statement truthful and accurate?
Yes, sir.
As you sit here today and as you've reviewed it, do you still believe it to be truthful and accurate?
Yes, sir.
I don't think I have any other questions at this time.
Officer Davis, I just have a few. You, like Officer Tate, have been working there 11 months?
Yes, sir.
And with Lieutenant Coffey as your supervising officer?
Not direct supervisor officer.
No.
He was like above our sergeant. Like, he's a supervisor, but
Of the shift, he's a supervisor of the shift. No.
he's there
I
for
see
the
him
shift,
taking-
but he's like, Miss Brown's like a direct supervisor that we
Okay.
report to.
Okay.
And then like Coffey's above her.
When you all went to the annex on the 21st of June, it was you and Mr. Officer Tate and Ethan Ferguson and you and Lieutenant Coffey, correct?
There was another officer, Brandon Johnson.
Okay. But were those five people had gone in to put people back where their assigned bunks were?
Yes, sir.
I mean, did you believe that it would take that many people, or did it just work out that way?
You know, it just worked out like that.
And so you and Officer Tate were there, and in fact, you were the one that interacted initially with
Mr. Kyle, yes, sir.
And Mr. Kyle went away from you and started accusing Mr. Coffey of being a racist.
Yes, sir.
And you indicated you hadn't seen anything from Mr. Coffey along those lines, right?
That's right.
Did at that point where he first came into contact with Lieutenant Coffey, did any of you other officers, well, first of all, did he ask for your assistance with Mr. Kyle in any way?
Inside the dorm?
Inside the dorm?
No, sir.
But you escorted Mr. Kyle sort of out into the annex or into the hallway after he was pushed outside.
Yes, sir.
Now, I want to ask you about that. Did you see the video?
Yes, sir.
And in your training, did you learn that resistance can change from active to passive?
Yes, sir.
And so when Mr. Kyle was, first, let me ask this. We talked about shoving. You know, he was shoved out of the annex.
Yes, sir.
Did you see the video?
Yeah.
And you saw it a couple of times,
Yeah.
if not more than a couple. Do you understand as a CO what the shoving of Mr. Kyle was about?
Yeah, he wouldn't listen to get his stuff, and wouldn't get his stuff and kept cussing, ranting and raving. So he had to be hands-on, moved out of the door.
But after he was in the hallway,
I don't recall it. I mean, I didn't see nothing in the hallway, so.
but you didn't see that shoving in the hallway.
No, I didn't see no.
And you didn't see the striking of Mr. Kyle. We know that from your statement right here.
I didn't know nothing about shoving in the hallway.
But you saw Mr. Kyle standing with his possessions in his hands.
Yes, sir. He dropped everything.
And when did he drop everything?
I guess probably 2 seconds after the indicated when the situation happened.
After he was struck, he dropped everything, didn't he?
Yes, sir.
And so the situation there didn't de-escalate, it escalated.
Yeah. He dropped his stuff and he started back again, cussing, ranting and raving, and I walked him up to where we set the inmates at, where they're getting booked in, and then I put him in the hose.
Have you had any training with Mr. Marcy or otherwise where there's a racial factor to something going on? Have you had any training that it might be better for either you or Officer Tate, another African American CO, to handle that type of a situation? Have not had anything like that. And then Officer, he didn't indicate to you or anybody else that he needed your assistance with Mr. Coffey. He's asked you about the continuing to maintain care of the inmate. I believe that's what it said on page under. He's going to try to keep switching this thing back and forth. It's number 2. Is that? It's the 8.1.
I don't have it.
I don't have it. I don't think.
Number 4 right there.
I may have it. Here it is. I'm not going. He's asked you about, under level 3, he asked you about the last sentence in that. Once inmates are perceived as actively resistant, officers should not relax care until the subject is fully secured in an isolated cell. To you, does relaxing care mean that you continue to use force that might or might not be required, or does it just mean that you're continuing to see to it that this person does what's required of it to get to an isolated cell?
You do what's required to get to an isolated cell.
Officer Davis, I believe that's all. I thank you.
Anything else? Thank you, Mr. Davis. You're free to leave.
I'm going to give this back to somebody else for you.
I would just note for the record that I have subpoenaed Richard Corey Kyle to be here. It's my understanding he is not present. I don't intend to ask the court or the chair to issue a show cause or request one, but I will move forward. I did want to note that for the record. And I call Mr. James Coffey. Mr. Coffey, will you please state your name for the record? James Coffey. Again, you're welcome to remove your mask if you'd like, or if you would like to leave it on, whatever you prefer to do. It might be a little easier for you. And what was your previous position with the Sheriff's Department?
Lieutenant.
How long had you served in that role?
Probably about 3 years.
How long total were you with the Sheriff's Department?
Since December of 1999, other than 2 years that I left, then came back.
Okay. That was from, if I recall, 2014 to 2016?
Yes.
And when you hired back in 2016, what position did you hire in?
CO.
Okay. And then what was were you a CO when you left to go the other job in 2014?
I was a sergeant.
Okay. So when you hired back in, you hired at a lower rank, and then did you go back to sergeant at some point? And how long did you serve as a sergeant?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Approximately?
Probably years.
Okay. And then after being a sergeant, was your next promotion to
Lieutenant?
Okay. You'll just let me finish. Okay. That's all right. And how long had you served as lieutenant prior to your termination of employment?
Probably about 3 years.
Okay.
Right at it, somewhere around there.
All right. And as a lieutenant of the jail, who was your direct supervisor?
Captain Miles.
And I assume, as I've asked many of the other COs and even Ms. Laws, you have been trained in policies and procedures of the Sheriff's Department?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And specifically, have you been trained in use of force?
Yes.
What type of training have you received?
I've had use of force training several times, defensive tactics, the policy and procedure, all kinds of it.
My understanding that as officers, you all undergo a certain amount of in-service each year?
40 hours every year.
Okay. And is that the same things every year, or is it rotate topics? How does that go?
It rotates.
And as part of that rotation, every year or two, it does,
We'll go for use of force, defensive tactics, stuff like that.
okay. Now, obviously, you know why we're here today. There was an incident on June 21st, 2021, correct?
Yes.
And that was with Richard Corey Kyle.
Yes.
What do you recall, the reason, or let's just walk through. We've seen the video, that sort of thing. You're walking into the annex with a clipboard in your hand. There are several other officers, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Can you kind of take us through for the
We went
members?
in to move inmates back to where they should have been, and Mr. Davis told Corey Kyle to get his stuff and move back to where he should be.
Let me stop you for a second. What was it? Why did you all decide to redo?
I moved everybody because the bullies in there was telling the older people and everybody where they was going to sleep, but they were putting 70-year-old men on the floor, and I said, no, that's not going to happen.
Okay. And is that something that happens on occasion that you have to redo the annex? Okay. And specifically, Mr. Kyle, he was near the door. It's my understanding there's 24 bunks in that annex, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then there's some sort of numbering system as to who gets a bunk next. Can you explain that?
There's 24 bunks. We have 40 spots available. Number 25, if you're in 25, you move to a bunk when somebody gets released. Mr. Kyle was in mat 37 the night before, but he moved to bunk 25, or mat 25, so he could get a bunk.
Okay. And in order to do that, is Mr. Kyle supposed to have permission, or how does that occur?
You should have had permission from an officer, yes.
Okay. And so he had moved his stuff to place 25, for lack of a better word.
Yes.
And then whenever you all decided to redo assignments, is that what appeared to agitate him, or you know? And go ahead, from there, what happened?
Mr. Davis told him to get his stuff and move, and he gets up immediately, starts cussing, raising cane. He comes running at me, pointing his finger and calling me a racist, UMAF, and F you, James Coffey, and that's what he was saying, screaming.
Right.
And at that point, I told him to get his stuff and get out, because he was upsetting other inmates.
Okay. And did he comply?
No.
All right. What happened then?
I told him numerous times to get out, and he refused, and I put him out.
Okay. Now, he's made a complaint that you shoved his head into a wall in his complaint form. Officer Davis's statement said that he had tripped over his own mat. Did you ram his head into a wall or anything?
No, sir.
Okay. Whenever the video shows that you did shove him out of the door,
yes.
Why did you use that level of force?
Because it was the force, that was the resistance that he was showing.
Okay.
I matched his aggression with the use of force.
Okay, and can you describe for the board why his level of force, or excuse me, why his resistance level warranted the force that you
He
used?
come at me yelling and screaming, pointing his finger in my face. When he ran at me, pointing his finger, at that point, I could have acted and actually struck him then, but I did not.
Okay.
All I wanted was him out of the pot.
Okay. And you chose instead to move him.
Remove him.
And we've looked at the policy, you've heard it, I went over with everyone, that at level 3, when there's active resistance, it appears that you can use rough physical force.
Yes,
Right?
sir.
And rough physical force, does that include shoving?
Yes.
Does that include open hand slaps?
Yes.
Okay, and is that the training that you've undergone?
Yes.
And did you comply with the policy as you knew it?
Yes.
When you go out into the hall and see the video at that point, what happened whenever you're out in the hall?
When I pushed him out the door, he continued screaming and hollering and being non-compliant. So I stepped over to him, trying to get him to calm down. He then screams in my face. His spit hits me in the face, is why I slapped him.
Okay. And at that point in time, he did have some things in his hands.
He did.
What did he consider to be, or did he continue to be non-compliant?
Yes, sir.
It appears from the video, as Mr. Capps has described too, he drops his things and then he takes an even more aggressive approach. In that split second from the time you perceived him as being actively resistant, you pushed him into the hallway, in that very short time period, at any point in time did you feel like, oh, he's he's passively resistant now, so I can let up?
No, sir.
Okay. Was anything in your training ever have taught you that that's the way you should have handled the situation?
Yes.
I mean, the situation, should you have let up or should you have continued?
As long as he is posing a threat, no, I should not let up.
Okay. And we've looked at the policy and I've read it over and over, and it says that, I don't want to paraphrase, you've heard what it says, that you should continue to use the level of care until the inmate is put into a isolated cell. Is that something along those lines? I've not said a word for it.
Yes.
And it's what does that, in your training of 20 years and serving as the lieutenant over the jail, what does that mean?
Until he is 100% compliant and not raising his voice and not causing a problem or posing a threat, you do not stop until he is isolated away from all other inmates and officers.
Okay. And you did open hand slapping, correct? Okay. And there was another shove.
Yes.
Okay. And then you back off.
Yes, sir.
Okay. At what point? Why did you back off at that point?
I was just backing up away from him to see if he would calm down that way, and he did not. He still continued.
Okay. And then what was your response to that?
Well, when he comes back towards me and pointing his finger again, I could have got him, I could have reacted to that and put him in the floor, pepper sprayed him or anything, but I chose not to.
Right. And at some point in time you did, I can't remember if you removed him or if Officer Davis removed him to the drunk tank.
Officer Davis is the one that got him by the arm, and I assisted him to do it.
Okay.
Took him up front, set him down. He continued to be aggressive, and then we put him in the whole cell.
Okay. So even after you removed him from the situation, you sat him down for a period of time.
Yes.
He continued to act out.
Yes.
Okay. And then he eventually was placed in an isolated
Yes,
cell.
sir.
At any point in time, from what you described to me and having watched the video, did you act outside the authority that had been invested in you by the Sheriff's Department of Hamblen County?
No.
Did you act in accordance with the policy as you've been trained and as you know it?
Yes.
At what point in time did you realize that management above you had an issue with the way you handled the situation?
That was on the Friday before I was terminated on that following Monday.
Okay. So you were terminated on July 19th.
I think it was the 16th.
Okay.
And
And
the 15th, maybe when I back. It was the 15th when I Thursday.
all right, that was on a Thursday. And so it was nearly a month after this incident had occurred, right?
Yes.
At any point in time, had Sheriff Jornigan or Captain Mize or Captain Laws or Captain Mullins or any other member of management of the Sheriff's Department came to you and asked you what occurred or what your side of the story was?
No, sir.
The other COs that were there, at least the ones we've spoken to today, they testified that they were never asked to give a statement. You asked Mr. Davis to give a statement, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and he did that, right?
Yes.
At any point in time, whenever you did find out that there was an issue on that Thursday prior to separation of employment, what occurred to alert you to the situation that there was an issue?
Some of the officers that came to me and told me that they had, Mr. Kyle had been back there, and Marcy and Captain Miles and Lieutenant Harvey.
Was that on that same day that they had been with them? Or do you know?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think it was.
And so, in response to hearing that, what did you do?
I went upstairs to the detective, James Brooks. I know he's in criminal affairs, and I asked him if he had had a complaint about it.
What was his response?
He said he had it, and he had the complaint the day before, but he no longer had it. It had been took to the DA's.
And did you make any inquiry as to why it had sit in the DA's office?
No.
There was some testimony from Captain Mullins about a conversation in which he was present with the DA's investigator, Mr. Bob Ellis. When did that meeting occur?
That was on Friday.
Okay, so on Thursday, you speak to Mr. Brooks. The following, or the very next day, on Friday, you were.
I was called by Captain Mullins to come upstairs and speak with him and Mr. Ellis.
Okay, and what do you recall about that conversation?
Mr. Ellis said that Corey Kyle wasn't going to press charges, and that if they showed the video to anybody, that I would be found.
And what was your response?
I said I didn't do it.
Okay. Any other conversation between you all at that point?
Captain Mullins and Mr. Ellis both continued to say that I would be found if that video showed to anyone or whatever.
Was it your understanding in speaking to them, though, that there were not going to be charges brought against you? Do you know when that changed?
Had to be over the weekend because when I came into work on Monday, when I went upstairs to get the warrants, as I always do, Chief Mize said, step in my office, and he handed me the termination.
Okay. Who else was present?
Nobody.
Did you all have any conversation about that, or did you?
I just told him I didn't agree with it.
And had Captain Mize ever said anything to you about it?
No.
So it happens June 21st, you're fired July 19th, almost 30 days later. And although they claim you had abused an inmate, they left you in your role as a lieutenant over the jail for almost 30 days.
Yes.
That struck you as ironic?
Yes.
Have you ever had another excessive force complaint against you?
Never.
I don't have any additional questions at this time.
Yeah.
Mr. Coffey, I want to ask you to look at your statement that was made. I guess you made this back on June 21st. Can I ask you to look at that? I don't know if you had it marked. No, we haven't. That's just a copy.
Yeah,
of it.
incident report.
Yeah, incident report.
Yeah, it's exhibit 1.
Okay. Know the feeling.
Yes.
And I'm sure that you're very familiar with that because you entered it. It looks like the incident was on 6/21, and you entered it, and that is some type of electronic entry. Is that right? That you all do on that same date? And he says that you set out very clearly that inmate Kyle is cursing and he's calling you a racist and this type of thing. And we did see on the video where he approached you rather quickly and had his finger in your face. It's your contention now today that you could have struck him at that point in time?
That is an act of aggression coming towards me in a rapid manner with your hand. Yes.
Pointing his finger?
In my face, yes.
How
In
close?
my personal space.
How close
He was very close. In fact, I told him to back up and get out of my face.
Okay. And how many officers were with you there at that point?
Let's see, Officer Davis was in there, Officer Tate. They said Brandon Johnson. I don't remember Mr. Johnson being there. And then Officer Ferguson.
Ferguson. And were you all there in close proximity to each other?
I think Ferguson and Tate were on the upper end. I'm not sure.
So I asked you this to ask you this question. Did you feel physically threatened by Mr. Kyle?
Mr. Kyle has assaulted me before in the past.
That's that an incident report made of that?
Yes, it was.
He has assaulted you.
Yes, he did.
What occurred?
He grabbed hold of my arm and jerked my arm.
Okay. How long ago was that?
It's been several years ago. Brady Kimbrough was chief of that at that time, so it's been a long time.
So there's a history there with you and Mr. Kyle then?
There's a history with every officer in the jail, Mr. Kyle.
Did it ever occur to you at any point during this situation that soft hands by both you and another officer could have been used to remove Mr. Kyle or to force him to do what you wanted him to do?
I didn't need any help to remove Mr. Kyle. Or, I mean, the officers were right there. If I had needed help, they would have stepped in and helped.
You didn't need any help, but it had escalated to where it did, where we were able to
I removed Mr. Kyle from the cell block due to his behavior, upsetting other inmates. If I had needed help removing him, Officer Davis was right there. He would have assisted. I did not need help. I had him and pushed him out the door. It happened in about
Mr. Coffey, I'm not asking you if you had the physical ability to remove him.
Okay.
I'm asking you, would it have been a better thing so that the situation didn't escalate, that you and another officer could have soft-handed Mr. Kyle out of that annex?
Objection, calls for explanation.
Calls for an opinion, which we've been asking about all day long.
Overruled. Okay, I can answer that. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what Mr. Kyle's behavior was going to be after I told him to remove him from the cell block. I cannot foresee that.
Can you foresee that it could have very well been a better thing for two COs to have soft-handed him out rather than throwing him out into the hallway?
I didn't throw him out. I pushed him out the door. I did not throw him.
Okay, I'm sorry, I used the wrong word. That rather than pushing him out, could it have been a better choice to have soft-handed him out with another officer?
If there had been another officer, we would have still done the same thing. He still would have had been took out of the door. We'd have had to drag him out of the door.
Okay. You know, Officer Davis was there the whole time. In fact, Officer Davis accompanied you and Mr. Kyle out the door or something.
Yes.
He was a very large man.
Yes.
And quite capable of having managed Mr. Kyle by himself. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
In light of the history that you have had with Mr. Kyle, his assaulting you, would it have been a better choice to allow Mr. Davis to assume that role?
Second objection.
Overruled.
I'm an officer. That's my job. He come at me, so it's my place to step up. It ain't another officer's place to take my part.
Is that part of your training?
Yes.
That if someone assaults or creates a trouble that you alone have to respond to? Is that your training?
No, I didn't say me alone. I'm just saying I don't back down from an inmate. I never have in over the 20 years I've been there, and I'm not going to. Because when you do that, you lose control.
Let me go back and ask you to look at your statement again.
Okay.
You've told us here today, I think, and I wrote it down, that when he was yelling in your face, that spit from his yelling hit you, and that's why you slapped him.
Yes, it is.
So it wasn't to de-escalate the situation, as you said in your statement, and I asked you to look at it, see if it doesn't say that.
I know it does.
So it wasn't to de-escalate, it was because you got saliva from his yelling on you.
And that's also to de-escalate the situation.
Okay.
In my experience, when you do that, then it pretty much stops it.
But it didn't in this situation.
It never does with Mr. Kyle most of the time.
Well, there's your history.
Most of the time. It's not only me, it's every officer in the jail.
What I'm asking about, Mr. Coffey, is with the history that you have, your single interaction with him didn't de-escalate anything.
One incident that happened probably 18 years ago.
One incident. Okay. But you remember it, that's for sure.
Yeah, I remember.
Okay. Let me have just a second, Your Honor. Your Honor, Mr. Chairman. That's all I have. Thank you.
Just briefly,
Mr. Coffey, you make the statement that you didn't back down from the inmate. Is that because you've been trained not to do so?
Yes.
And we went over Rule 8.1 ad nauseum here today, and it clearly states that officers are not required to retreat or to back down. Is that right? And in your 20 years of training and in the multiple times that you've been instructed in the use of force, has that always been your understanding?
Yes, sir.
And is that your understanding as you're sitting here today?
Yes, sir.
And is it also your understanding that decisions about an officer's use of force are not supposed to be viewed from a hindsight perspective, but instead they're supposed to be viewed at the time that they were made? An officer has to determine what is reasonable perception at the time, right?
Yes.
And as you sit here today, do you feel that your response was reasonable to Mr. Kyle's resistance?
Yes.
And do you believe that you followed policy as you knew it?
Yes.
You've heard testimony from Ms. Laws today that confirmed that acting within authorized use of force. Do you agree with her?
Yes.
I don't have anything else.
Nothing further.
I don't, Mr. Chairman, we would rest at this point in time.
Giving a rebuttal.
No rebuttal.
Let me make a couple of comments. First of all, in the Exhibit 2, the termination form, there are certain sections of the regulations and policies of the Hamblen County Sheriff's Department that are cited that were grounds for termination, but nobody's filed those. Is somebody gonna file those?
We have that, and we
I don't know what they.
3.6.
He's got 2.8, 3.6.
I think I have copies of it if you'd like to see.
I would think, well, I think that'd be important to the board, since that's the grounds that were given.
I have 3.6 and 3.8.
No objection.
Okay. If we can just file those next exhibit, collect.
And we got the video.
And one other thing, I had initially said before we started that it was my plan that the conclusion that we would verbally give our decision. I've changed my opinion because there's documents here I've never seen that I think I need time to read through. The statute gives us 90 days to make a written opinion. We're not going to do that unless the other members object. My inclination is that if y'all want to argue, I'm going to let you argue, but that we would reconvene, and I think we have to deliberate in public, so it's not, and we're not going to talk, and we can't. So I just need time to review these before I can make a decision. I think they're important to the decision, and so my inclination is, again, unless the other board members object, that we're going to adjourn after y'all argue, if you want to argue, and then we'll reconvene, at which time we would announce our decision.
That would be my only point that you've already mentioned. I would agree that deliberation should be public.
Well, they will be.
And then
we will reconvene in an open meeting.
I understand. Yeah, I don't have an objection to that.
Okay. And we can pick a date today, or I can then contact council later. And I frankly don't know if public notice has to be given of the reconvening.
I would think
I'll see.
Probably a good decision.
Well, here's what I would suggest we do, that let me contact council if it's okay, and then I'll contact the board members, and we'll just agree on a date, and then the county can give notice, required notice, and then we'll render our decision in an open meeting. Does council wish to argue? It's up to you all. If you want to, you can. If not,
I think we've argued a lot in our testimony.
your question.
I'm agreeable.
Okay. The only thing I would say is that obviously we can't talk after today until we come back, and we won't. And I would also caution people, I don't have any reason to believe this will occur, but caution everyone that under no circumstances is anyone to contact any of us before we reconvene. That would be highly inappropriate. Again, I don't have any reason to believe, nobody's contacted me about this before, so I don't have any reason to believe that would occur, but that would be highly inappropriate. So I would caution no one to make any contact with us until we reconvene.
Other than for calendar purposes.
Yeah, other than to talk to you on the schedule, and I'll talk to the other members when we reschedule, make sure it's all on the day. What I would like to do is take all the exhibits, I'll copy those and mail the other board members copies of them, but there's just things here I've never seen. I've been on this board for like 10 days, so I just haven't read any.
And I think the rules, Mr. Chairman, I think the rules allow you to, and allow you all to continue to investigate if that's either.
I don't really think we would need to investigate. And we couldn't do that outside of I don't see how we can.
No, I meant for question. What I meant to say this earlier, that you all have the ability to question our witnesses, which you didn't do.
Right.
But that's right.
I didn't have any reason. So. Okay. So we are adjourned as of today. We will reschedule a final hearing with the consent of council and all the board members. Public notice of that will be given. At that time, we will announce our decision, and we'll need a court reporter back to at that time.
Is there any idea as to approximately how long we may be looking at there to do that? And I'm not trying to hold sooner rather than later. I would hope
it will be significantly less than 90 days. Here's the problem I have. I have a 2-day trial in Granger County in 3 weeks, a 5-day trial here in 4 weeks. I got to write briefs about both of those. I don't think that I would be in a position to do it within 30 days, but maybe 45 days. I just don't see how I can do it. I've got to think about this. Maybe look at the law. I don't know.
Okay. Well,
I'll do it as soon as I can.
I understand. We'll touch base whenever we try to get it.
Right. No, I'll try to reschedule it. Okay. I appreciate everybody. Thanks, both lawyers. Everybody did a good job. Thank you very much. And make sure I got all the exhibits.